Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. I have returned. It's been just shy of 3 weeks. I was neither beaten nor detained. I did get to go to a fake country, though. That was wild. I mean, like, the Turks can just show up in your country, and they can say this is a new country. And they can put the police there, and everyone just goes along with it. They have border checks and everything. Still, I must add, I mention this every time. I had less trouble getting into literally a fake country than I did my own northern neighbor of Canada.
Yeah,
But uh, out of all my travels, and let's say I
I'm
think
not surprised.
I've been to, if you count the Vatican, 8 actual countries at this point. Most of which have been Europe, and the only one I've had trouble getting into was Canada. Uh, I mean, I crossed into Serbia from Hungary on like a beater bus um, with these guys who I don't know were probably involved in some illicit activity. They seemed like the kind. And the worst I had to do is I just had to put my bags through an X-ray thing at the border checkpoint. The Canadians they held me for like 45 minutes for questioning. They let me in eventually. That was only the first time. Second time I went to Canada
That
was
is
fine.
insane.
Yeah, it
45 minutes.
yeah. They gutted my car. It was I mean and it was I mean I learned the lesson that whenever I cross the land border, I want my car to be
Uh,
squeaky
I-
clean.
I'll tell you this happened to me many years ago, before you were born.
Anti-Slav discrimination, but I digress.
It could have been. So my friend and I, we were both in art school, and we went to Toledo, Ohio, because they have like this enormous Picasso collection, early Picasso, like rose and blue period. And we went to other states as well. Anyways, we're driving back. Along the way, we picked up these chips from a 7-Eleven, Batman chips, some of the early Batman movies. So we're, we're at the border crossing, and uh, he shouldn't have done this, but he cracked me up. He says, "You boys ain't been thinking about bringing them back those Batman chips, right?" He said it. Anyways, anyways, I lost it, and I'm I'm in tears laughing. I thought it was like one of the funniest things. He just did it on the spot. He's an extremely quiet guy. What possessed him to say it there and then? And they just we opened the window and they said pull over. And same kind of thing. They got in the car. Where did you get this? And it's like literally postcards from a museum, right? Anyways, I'll never forget it. That was one of the funniest things.
Oh no, that's great. That also reminds me, well, because I've broached the topic of border crossing experiences. Romania was another interesting one. Serbia into Romania from Serbia, and like they didn't check the car, they didn't hold us, they took forever to process it, and I'm trying to figure out whether were they searching me on Interpol or were they just being lazy about it. And I think,
Mhm.
with all due respect to our Romanian friends, I think they were just being a little lackadaisical with their job, in which
Yeah.
I can't blame them. Um, but you have to wonder. I mean, how much when it comes to these minor border crossing checkpoints, obviously I have my position on border control and immigration. I'm sure you all have heard that me talk about that to hell and back, as it were. But I don't know. You have to wonder how much can actually go on at these checkpoints, and in a way, subtracting the liberal elements for it, I do kind of like the freedom of movement in Europe. And honestly, that's being tarnished by mass migration. I'm getting way off topic here, but
Hmm.
I've broached the subject. I'm gonna see it through. And I don't know. It is strange, but I'm still seething. And honestly, while I have my objective uh, opposition to some of Trump's talk about the 51st state, viscerally, I have to think the country I got hassled at most maybe shouldn't exist. Maybe it should be subsumed by my country. I'm not saying I
Hmm.
think that rationally, but I'm saying I might think that emotionally sometimes when I think about this topic, with all due respect to our Canadian friends. How is it, and I bring this point up all the time whenever I talk about this with anyone, how is it a country that the United States was at war with in my lifetime, that being Serbia, I was alive, during the 1999 bombings.
Yeah.
How is it I had an easier time getting into there than a country that is a 3-hour drive from me?
Yeah, I know. It's you know, and
And Biden was in
I mean,
office. It wasn't. It couldn't
yeah,
even been political.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, Canadian border guards can be like that. They can just be. I remember one time going to the States with some Serbian friends of mine, and we went to meet this Polish guy, and like
Probably
we
illicit
were not very
activity.
well prepared. We went in, they let us through, no problem. And we spent like the late morning and early afternoon at a range. It was the first time I ever fired an AK-47, and on the way back, I mean, I don't know if they can smell gunpowder, but anyways, yeah.
It,
So, but we better get going. We're both going off topic.
yes, I just it hit a nerve. I'm glad nothing happened, and
Yeah. Nothing happened while we were gone.
yeah, nothing happened while I was gone, and I was neither beaten nor detained. But the last story I will have about my travel is that, at least in this regard, I mean, I'm sure it'll come up as time goes on, is that I think aside from being detained by the Canadian Border Police, which I'm not going to let this go, by the way.
Mm.
But probably the most frightening, which really wasn't that frightening, but the most I thought about my mortality on that trip this past time is I was on the north side of Nicosia. I'd crossed the checkpoint under the Turkish occupation, and I'm just on the streets. I'm looking around at the shops, and I see 6 Turkish soldiers walking in my direction. I just duck into the nearest shop.
Oh wow.
It was like, I don't know. They looked like they're on their way to, you know, be dismissed from duty or whatever. But it's like I know that 99% chance nothing bad is going to happen, but I don't want to be in these guys' line of sight. It's just that simple.
Yeah, thank God America stood up for Greece, the home of democracy.
Yeah,
That was amazing. What a great job.
I'm glad there's such Western solidarity, and that these nations would never be cannibalized if it's convenient in the
Uh,
moment. Like
yeah.
it's
They're so focused on Russia, this like, yeah,
yeah,
but you know what? We got to let Turkey have it
yeah.
because Turkey is a foil against Russia. Sorry,
Hey,
Greece.
yeah.
Priorities.
At least the Russians are boxing the Black Sea. It's we won. We saved civilization.
Yeah.
Yeah. But okay, now let's begin. We have a minutia
Okay.
minute. So the floor is all yours. I have everything up. I know you had a little bit
Okay.
of difficulty sorting out the maps today, but let's
I
go.
did because I got my dates mixed up. I've been screen capping maps and stuff for the last 2 days, but I got them
Why
mixed
do
up.
I even pay this guy?
But you don't. So we're gonna start in a direction of the front line that is generally not that exciting, and we'll build to one where there's been some massive changes and big gains for the Ukrainians. But let's begin with Volchansk, which is in the north, in the Kharkov direction, north of Kharkov city. This is an area that Russia's been focusing on in a very slow, steady way for several months, and they now are well past the Volchansk city limits, which are complete rubble. But there was another advance. I believe this is from 2 days ago, and they keep expanding this area. Now, a lot of these incursions, you can see, beside where that large grouping is, that large section of orange, you can see little sections of orange, like the one up towards the left, um, up left hand corner. That has been going on in Sumy as well. And what the Russians are trying to do is pull away Ukrainian troops from the Donetsk. Interestingly, uh, no one has ever conquered Donetsk by going straight through it. It has only happened by enveloping it from the north and the south. And anyway, so now Russia hasn't been doing that. It's kind of been doing both. Um, so I'll give you the next is the sort of the blow up of the area south of Volchansk, in Novosich. They're just outside the town of Novosich. Um, anyways, to keep expanding this area, I suppose there is a new border that Russia wants to draw, uh, extending from like Sumy, maybe Chernigov, definitely Kharkov, all along the northern front. So there's that, and then the next I have is again these small incursions into Sumy. Here's an example of it where they're just going in. I don't know like how dedicated they are to these fronts. They'll go in and then you don't hear about anything for about a week or two, and then another small incursion. They're not huge priority, but again, I think they probably match when there are rotations. That's one of my guesses. There's other guesses, and we'll explore them as we keep looking at the maps. The next section is Kupiansk, and I'm starting with this map in order to point out like the area, the road that the Russians want to take. Right, they're coming in from the north now. Those incursions that the Russians made before you went on vacation, they're still there, and in some areas the Russians have expanded their control. So I don't know exactly, if they're not orange or blue, it generally means that this is an area where there's not many fighters, but if in this case it would have been the Russians that made these incursions, but they don't fully control this area. One, there are very few soldiers there. Two, it's contested, but it's not the kind of solid blue that it once was. So you can see that the supplying Kupiansk from the north is not an easy thing, and it's not an easy thing even the areas that the Russia controls from the northeast. So they want this forested area very badly, and in order to have leverage instead of just fighting directly. Now, that said, the Russians still control the industrial area and apartment complexes that snake along the Oskal River. They're not on the east side, they're actually still on the west side. Remember that the Ukrainians here, over like a 3, 4, 5 day period, made rapid advances throughout the city, and then it extended by taking more and more blocks. But they took over the farm area out, and let's say west of Kupiansk and north of Kupiansk, and that's what the Russians are trying to regain in order to have a different vector to regain Kupi, Kupiansk further west of the Oskal River. Uh, we're just going to take a quick peek at some of the areas that the Russians are capturing south of the Kupiansk area. This is south of Petropavlovsk. Um, it's on the bigger, sorry, it's north of Kupiansk, this one that we're looking at. So you can see in this slide that they've taken over several of the fortifications to the north of the city. They're going to need this. You can see that they've reached one of the highways that leads into the city from the north on the west side of the Oskal River. And then this next slide gives you an overall picture of where this is happening. The Russians have been making, you can see these incursions that they're pushing in the orange bits into the blue sector. This was sort of like a crescent moon a few months ago, and now again, it's very slow paced. Now, I have to mention that George Macmillan III was on World War Now. Our friends Dimitri and Conrad had him on, and they had a really great um, session with him, about an hour or 45 minutes long, well worth watching. Um, One of the things he said was, the longer the war takes, the more bankrupt Europe will become, and the fewer options America will have. So I think that's an interesting take, because that kind of, if it's true, that would tie in with why doesn't Russia focus on going from the north and the south with regards to Donetsk instead of head on? Why fight it the way it is, right? I mean, I think there's a truth in it. We see that industry, more industries both in Britain and Britain's now, it's Tata Steel Works is about to go kaput, and of course we've talked about BASF and Volkswagen uh, and the other German car manufacturers, Mercedes, who are moving their plants to China because they can't afford um, the kind of gas prices, the exorbitant American gas prices, in order to prop up the American empire.
But at
So
least Europe defeated its dependency on Russian energy.
yes, wow, what an amazing job! What an what an amazing job, Europe. Um, as far as Kupiansk, the last one I have is this blow up where they're entering a town, Kurylovka, of one of those stupid trench networks has obscured the spelling. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about this. Like, I know that's a. I guess I'm thinking, is that really Putin's intention? Certainly, it's an outcome that the how is Europe going to survive? Basically, just buying American hardware to give um to Ukraine.
Especially if we are to believe the narrative, which I don't necessarily believe that relations between Europe and the United States are souring.
Yeah, see, okay, I'll tell you something. Here's something interesting. Um, what's his name? Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive. He did a video. He's convinced that Europe really is going to find a path. It's going to splinter. It's not going to like this isn't about some civilizational collapse. It's not as dramatic as that, but it is about Europe going a different way, breaking out of their hold of Europe. That's his claim, right? Which is kind of the opposite of kind of like what we've been saying and Berletic has been saying for a number of years, that it's fakery. I mean, they do. Carney's speech is not. It's it's shocking on some level, but it's not. It's not the speech. I mean, he was a banker, um, turned into a politician.
Never heard of it before.
Yeah, uh, it's not exactly. Like, I don't want to say it's not brave. It's not as brave as some speeches given by some dissident figures in the past, especially during the Cold War era. But it was surprising. I don't think anybody can, he said this is a rupture. This is for real. I don't know. Well, I mean, Trump still didn't get what he wanted in Greenland. I mean, what he got he got what he was already going to get anyways, which is like, why do you make such a big deal out of getting more bases in Greenland when Denmark has never been opposed to America having bases in Greenland, right? I mean, we might revisit this. Trump may, in 6 months, start this all over again. But for now, Canada's opened a consulate. There was another country, I forget who had it, that has opened up a consulate in Greenland. Like, yes, I guess from his point of view, Maduro, that was a success. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. But yeah, but so it's hard. I suppose it's hard to say. It's easy to make arguments either way. Um, I will say this though: most of the money that Ukraine is getting is they're getting it from Europe, including uh, like just money to to pay the civil service, to pay government workers. Uh, this includes soldiers, right? People who run factories, for the war effort. So,
Even
anyways, I
Zelensky himself.
yes,
But I do have to ask, I don't want to dwell on this too long because we can come back to it. I have to wonder how much of that is American money laundered through Europe so Trump can come home and say that we're divested from the Ukraine war. I'm not saying
yes, I can
that's
see.
for certain, but I think that's an angle worth exploring.
Yes, they know it's unpopular with the with the Americans, this war. Um, yes, I understand that angle. Hmm.
Because
Yeah,
this is something
the
that
best
we've
argument for that angle is that, yeah, the Europeans still keep buying it. Now, they're not the kind of support that Ukraine got. Like, obviously there's black money, there's dirty money here, right? That America is giving, that's not public. Like, obviously there's something illicit that is going on. I don't doubt that in a year, 2 or 3 from now, we'll find out, what this illicit thing that's happening is. But I don't doubt that, because when you look at what the Europeans are contributing, it's a little bit. I mean, I know they promised them 90 billion, but it's still. I mean, you look at what they contributed last year. America contributed almost nothing, and they're like, 3.5 billion, 4.9 billion. Like, it's not the kind of figures that we saw during during the time with when Biden was in power. Those 2 years with Biden, a lot more was given. Um, so I don't know.
yeah,
You
but
know.
I think especially if you want to get into the and I'm not saying we have to get into this right now, the conversation of an actual rift between the United States and Europe versus the more, let's just say, public spat view of Brian Berletic as the representative of that idea. I think that it would be interesting to look into it from that perspective because, like I said, I certainly lean more towards even if there are legitimate discontents that whatever rift is there is largely theatrical. But I digress.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm looking for a graph that I just can't find, but I had a graph of just a rapid change in the amount of money that Europe is giving to Ukraine to support it to keep it fighting, right? Um, but economically in Europe, things are not great. I've spoken to some people in Europe uh, who are not confident about the future and at all, and they consider that the war and the funding for the war is a major reason why that is, right? Um, so the question is how much financial depth does Europe have to keep doing this, right? That's what I'm concerned about.
Well, there's plenty of pensions to liquidate.
Yeah, that's what they will have to do.
I mean, that's what Friedrich Merz uh, that's what he says
That's
to the
what he says.
public.
Yeah.
We're gonna liquidate your pensions. We're gonna liquidate your health care. All these social programs that Europe has spent decades priding itself on. We need to burn that all to the ground because Russia might take Konstantinivka. That's what it is. And I hate to be in a position where I'm saying anything positive about Angela Merkel or any of these other clowns from 10 years ago, but at
Hmm.
least they would pick up the phone and call Putin.
Yeah.
And the Minsk agreements may have been a stalling tactic. They were. But at least there was an understanding. that, yeah, we're going to kick this can down the road because we're not willing to liquidate everything we own to fund Ukraine. Now, they were willing to
Yeah.
do plenty of other destructive things, both inside and outside of their countries.
Merkel must have known what the consequences would have been. That's why she played both
Oh,
sides.
absolutely. She was far too connected to the German business class, who at the very least saw a working relationship with Russia as a necessity, in which case they're completely vindicated. Because look at the state of German industry. And there's a lot of diversion. People will say it's because they shuttered the nuclear power plants after Fukushima. That's part of it. I'm not going to deny that. But number one, just the role of LNG in industry. Number two, when it comes to nuclear infrastructure, are you going to ignore the Russian-sized elephant in the room? Yes, I know that they could import from several places in Africa, Canada, the United States, Australia, even other former Soviet countries like Kazakhstan, in which case the Russians own a large share of the nuclear fuel and are heavily involved in the nuclear sector there. But point being is, yes, there are more options, but it still ignores what a massive player the Russians are in the global nuclear industry.
Yeah, I
But
mean, it's even affected the British economy.
oh, absolutely. But it just goes back to the fact that modern industrialized economies, the kind of lifestyle and standard of living that we enjoy, and I guess what you could call the first world, just for lack of a better term, that was directly dependent on a successful economic relationship, at least in Europe, between the Europeans and the Russians. And without that, Europe will slowly backslide. I'm not saying the United States is going to be all peached and cream. I'm not saying that we actually have a bright future ahead of us. But we have more of a domestic base to, let's just say, keep the lights on figuratively and literally a few years longer.
Right. And I guess what I'm getting at, the militarization of Europe, which might even cascade into, you know, um, compulsory military duty in a bad economic climate, that seems incredibly risky for the Europeans.
You mean giving every young man a gun when the country's on the brink of collapse might not turn out well?
Yeah, right? Like they've already witnessed this war to a great degree. There's a pattern about how it's been fought. People have had 4 years of propaganda. Um, the willingness, even Macron has said that sending in troops now, the Europeans, we are not in agreement. It's not a united front to send in troops,
I
right?
think
And of
it.
course,
Go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say now they'll always. He didn't say it, but what's implicit is America must be a backstop. Like we'll put them in as long as you guarantee that if we get into a fight with the Russians, you have to come in and save us, right? Which in a way puts America, of course, on the spot, right?
Yes, yes, it
Which
does.
which allows it gives the Europeans leverage not to commit as much, right? It's also like it is leverage in negotiations.
But I will say, on the point of European involvement in terms of troop deployments, whether that is in active combat, which is not going to happen, or in a quote unquote peacekeeping mission, one of the biggest indicators that this has no chance of success, in my opinion, is when you cannot gin up the energy in the Polish population to get in some sort of military standoff with the Russians to any serious degree, then you have no legs to stand on. And that doesn't take away from the existing anti Polish sentiments in Russian society. But when Donald Tusk has to come out and lecture the Polish population that, this is your war too, and it's not sticking, then the project is simply dead on arrival. No amount of 2 million foaming at the mouth Estonians is going to make up for that. They simply don't have the size, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the resources. I'm not saying Poland is some giant Poland is some superpower, but they're at least a mid-sized European country that could field a decently sized military that could be a thorn in the side of the Russians if worse would come to worse. But when you cannot gin up that kind of energy in a nation like Poland, with the contentious history between the two, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, they've seen 4 years of America not intervening more directly.
Oh yeah, it's
And
have
the last
fun.
of those 4 years of America giving the economic, um, most of the economic responsibility to Europe for the support of Ukraine, right? Like a lot of the a lot of the sort of the European chauvinism towards Russia stems from the belief that America will be there to protect them. That an institution fundamentally American like NATO is there to intervene and give Russia a lesson, right? Or like even collapse Russia the way they did the Soviet Union.
Yes.
That as soon as there's more at stake than that, they're not interested.
Which, not to go on about this too much longer, I have a couple points on that. Ukraine, although not a NATO member, although effectively is, seeing as the way this war is played
Hmm.
out, it
It's
shows.
more NATO than any NATO country right now.
Oh, absolutely. It shows that the relationship in NATO was never about America coming overseas to protect you. It was about you being the first wave. And this should be a lesson to Poland, to Romania, to the Baltic states, to really any other European country, that
Yeah.
you are close to Russia. And the way the strategists in the Pentagon have wargamed this, you guys go in first. You soften the Russians up, and the Americans come in after 3 years, 4 years, 5 years of you guys in this slog, and we deliver the final blow. At least that's the plan. I'm not saying it would work out that way, but that's what the Pentagon has wargamed. Where
Right.
we'll back you. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You even read the text of Article 5. Article 5 just says you're obligated to support NATO countries at war. It says nothing about direct military intervention. It doesn't specify in what way support would
Yes.
manifest. It could just
It,
be a simple pat on the back as far as
and the
the
only time
text
they
is
ever
concerned.
used it was to invade Afghanistan
Yeah, that's and
after
that.
9/11.
And while I'm not going to downplay that because that did happen, and I'm not saying these countries were capable of providing, say, the same amount of military force the Americans could. A lot of these were very symbolic forces. Now, countries like the UK, like France, especially in terms of Afghanistan, and a few other of the major European countries actually did commit major forces. But, for example, when you have Poland getting involved in Iraq, that is a symbolic gesture. It's
Yeah.
it's that simple, and that's what Article 5 looks like. And I know Iraq was an Article 5 situation, but that is the dynamics here. But when push comes to shove, when you actually find out what NATO is for, it's about you guys are the first line of defense, so we can defend our
Yeah.
interests. You're dying for the American Empire. The American Empire is not dying for you.
Yeah.
And I think to rub salt in that wound, Ukraine is still waiting for $250 billion in energy aid that was promised under the Biden administration, while their entire energy grid is on the brink of collapse.
Yes. The average city now has 8 hours of electricity in the dead of winter. It's better in Lvov, but it's still down half capacity. Some places are far worse. Kiev is like at 37%. And they've got these tents where people can warm up. Um, yeah, I mean, Russia is trying to destroy now their industrial capacity, and they're thinking that Russia is preparing for a spring offensive. We'll see. It's amazing how many generals Russia has switched and changed and moved about, but the way the war is being conducted is largely the same. And that could be because they expect something to happen once Ukraine is moving too rapidly. That I think, in that sense, Russia is trying to keep their powder dry because I think they expect something else will happen if they're too successful too rapidly.
Even Lavrov is saying something that effect, where it's all the diplomatic caveats. We are not seeking a fight with Europe, but we're ready. We would win. And it's been that way since before the Ukraine war started. They knew that if they pushed the envelope too far, if it was too much of a show, they risked further intervention by NATO, further direct
Yes.
intervention by NATO.
Hmm.
And,
Hmm.
and that's the reason why they've stayed their hand so much. And we've said this before, I'll say it again, that if Russia did even a tenth of what Israel has done in Gaza, the war would have escalated to a global scale by March of 2022.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, why don't we continue with the
Yes,
map,
please do.
the map update? So the next one is Konstantinovka. This is from 2 days ago. So the Russians have entrenched themselves in the southern part of Konstantinovka for several months now. There's a small area, more trench networks that they've taken. Still a relatively small area to the east of Konstantinovka. The other area that they're focusing now is the canal that runs north of Konstantinovka up to the Donetsk Serevets River. Um, that's what the next slide is, just north of Bakhmut. There's two areas that they've recently captured in the last 24 to 48 hours. If you want to, I don't know if you've put those maps up yet.
Yeah, I do have those.
Okay, so and then we're gonna get to the Gulyapolye direction, where now this is an example of the Ukrainians saving up their strength for this moment. The question is, did it come in time? We saw this in Kupiansk, where the Ukrainians made a very successful incursion over areas northwest of Kupiansk, and now we're seeing it north of Gulyapolye, but we're also seeing it in the Zaporozhye direction along the Dnieper River. And if you want to, yes, you've got the slide. So you can see that what the Russians have been doing since they captured Gulyapolye is they want to expand further west, and they've already taken a good deal of the first and second line of defenses by the Ukrainians. Uh, a few months ago, we showed you slides of just how large these are. They're as big, if not bigger, than the Surovikin line that was done a few years ago in 2023. So let's look at the area uh, north of Gulyapolye. You can see the orange outline that the Ukrainians captured. 2 days ago, they captured something like 100 square kilometers. When you tally up the three different areas that they took back from the Russians, and in this area of Dnepropetrovsk, they took three towns from the Russians, and then today they made a further incursion south into the line of defense, as you can see in the blue outline. That was from today's. Now, tactically and strategically, this is important for them. The next slide will show you from a bird's eye point of view, further out, what is the main strategy. So this is an area that for the Russians to supply their forces here is more difficult, primarily because they don't have any major cities around this area, and the Ukrainians have larger cities and more towns north of the uh, the line of defense. The other part is that the line of defense faces south, so it's easier to defend facing south than it is facing north. But if you put up the slide with the arrows, with the blue incursion and the two red arrows,
Yes.
Yeah, if you put that slide up, okay, so the circle, that's roughly where Gulia is. And that's really the biggest town in this area. And it's from here that the Russians want to go to the left, which is west, and then north. And you can see that what the Ukrainians are hoping for is to cut Gulia off. Now, obviously, the first question is, do they have enough manpower to do this? Right? How far will they get? Because the Russians are still making gains in other areas of the front line, but they have given the Russians a challenge here for sure. The question is, they should have done this earlier, let's say a few months ago, when most of the battle was around Pokrovsk. But again, we get into the same situation. They can be in Pokrovsk or they can be in Gulyapolye, but they can't be in both. And if we look at this incursion by the Ukrainians as them um, saving their strength for an attack, it's taking too long to do that, right? This is happening in winter. In a month, the roads are going to get very muddy, so it's going to become even more difficult for both sides. And for the winter generally, it's more difficult for them. So let's yeah, you can see the Zaporozhye region here, under the Zaporozhye header that I've written in our chat room. You can see the orange outlines to the far left corner. Those are the areas that the Ukrainians took from the Russians. Now, importantly, in this area of Zaporozhye, the Russians did not make any gains in the last like 10 days. So they were making gains at the end of January and maybe February 1st and 2nd, but after that, there were no gains. And that was kind of like a telltale sign that the situation there for the Ukrainians had stabilized and they pushed forward. This is one of the other areas where the Ukrainians have pushed forward. When I said that in tally, they uh, captured 100 square kilometers, this is part of that tally as well. Now, the Russians have moved forward in an area basically southwest of Orehov. So, they're still there. The Russians, I don't think, are going to give up on that. The next one is, again, in that area between Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk, the Russians have regained more of the town of Ivanovka. This is another town that has gone back and forth between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So that's surprising. Yeah, there's an overall view of it. Is it right? The orange indicates that they're in Dnepropetrovsk and not in Zaporozhye or Donetsk. And that's about it for the updates, for the frontline updates. Like I say, I guess the main takeaway is the Ukrainians still have reserves, but the reserves are not coming in quickly enough. Um, we'll have to wait for the spring to see exactly what happens. And of course, we have all the other news, and that too could be pivotal because Russia prioritized Ukraine over Syria, and that's one of the reasons why Syria fell. Russia had to be forced to make that decision in the same way that Ukraine has to make decisions. You can either have Pokrovsk for a little longer, or you can have Gulyapolye for a little longer, but you have to choose one or the other. In the end, they lost both. Yeah, I did have some slides of the Pokrovsk region. The Russians made some advances north of it. They completely took Rodinsky and are now moving in a different direction. Um, if I find the map, I'll here. You know what? This is a good example of what I'm saying about going through Donetsk is extremely hard. What you need is a pincer movement, right? This is an example of what I was trying to clarify earlier.
But I will
And
say on your
mm,
point about the Ukrainian reserves, and this certainly is not a unique take on my end, but we are seeing much more where the Ukrainians have to pick and choose where they want
Yes.
to make their stands. And they've always had the disadvantage being the smaller country with less manpower. That's always been the case. However, it's becoming more and more pronounced as time goes on. And you will notice that every few months, I would up to now and every 3 to 6 months, we could say, there always is that one holdout. Think Bakhmut, think Avdiivka, think Pokrovsk, just these areas, even Chazov Yar, where they have a very dug in defense, very pitched resistance to the Russian advances, while they hold that at the expense of everywhere else. And like I said, that's part
Yeah.
of the consequence of simpler being the smaller belligerent in this war, but it becomes more pronounced, especially after Kursk. It has become profoundly more pronounced. Kursk to Pokrovsk, I think, is when you really start to see that slow degradation on a noticeable scale, because it was always there. It was always, one could say, glacial, but I would argue that it became noticeable after the expulsion from Kursk, all
Yeah.
the way up until the fall of Pokrovsk in late 2025. Just that entire stretch of 2025 there.
Yeah. I
It,
think one of the reasons they went for Kursk was, I mean, I think obviously Russia has a manpower advantage, but they have a manpower advantage that they're not really utilizing. Now, what is the manpower advantage? Is it 2 to 1? I don't think so. I think it's 1.5 to 1, or at least that's what it seems is being utilized, right? Like, you get all kinds of wild figures, um, 650,000, 718,000 on the Russian side, but then at least 500 or 600,000 on the Ukrainian side. If Russia had twice as much, as some people speculate.
also 3 million North Koreans, but
Oh yeah, yeah, of course, the 3 million North Koreans. Um, if Russia did have that, then they really could make an incursion in Chernigov, for instance, or even expand more rapidly in Sumy. But they're not doing that, right? So I guess what I'm saying is maybe the disparity in numbers isn't as big as some people make. I'm just going by figures that I remember hearing in the fall of 2025. Like this
it's
would be
certainly
October, November.
not a full exploitation of Russia's manpower. And I don't just say that from their base of conscripts, because in Russian military doctrine, they're not going to put conscripts in the combat unless absolutely necessary. And uh, that being said, a lot of the contract soldiers they get to sign on after their service as conscripts do come from that pool. And of course, one could argue it's a form of soft conscription because you get them in for that year. You surround them with these people. They probably know guys who were on the front lines, etc., and they can get drawn in that way. But that's not the main point of discussion here. But even among, say, the contract soldiers, the guys who are fully signed on with the Ministry of Defense, they are not utilizing those. I mean, think about how many of those guys are sitting in places like Kaliningrad or Belarus, which suggests they're there in reserve in expectation this conflict will escalate to another country in Europe. That is my interpretation of the situation. I'm not necessarily saying it will, but I think based on Putin's statements, based on Lavrov's statements, based on Russia's own military actions both inside and outside of Ukraine, that's the direction they think things are going to go.
Right, right. Did you want to talk about the attempted assassination of Alexei, of the general?
Uh, yes, but I do have a
Mm,
couple of things to
go,
cover
go.
before then. Just in terms of Ukraine, allegedly the EU, and we'll see if they live up to this, are going to railroad Ukraine in by 2027, regardless of the quote unquote process, just which shouldn't shock anyone. And also, allegedly, and like I said, this is all alleged, the U.S. is leaning hard on Ukraine to just sign the agreement, the dubious peace agreement, make peace with Russia before June because we have the midterms to win. Now, like I said, that gets more into the discussions in the UAE, which gets into the assassination attempt on Alexeyev. So I'll give the ground to you to just give some background on Alexeyev, who was at the negotiations in the UAE, which we'll touch on in
Well,
a
he's a
moment.
deputy. Now, he is one of those generals that is not like in charge of logistics or the general that they assassinated Christmas 2024 with that electronic scooter bomb that went off. Uh, that guy was in charge of
WMDs, pretty much.
WMDs, but like, germ warfare essentially, and the labs that were potentially part of the creation of the COVID-19 virus, which is partly substantiated from the recent leaks from the Jeffrey Epstein files. So a lot of these generals were not like, they're not commanders. They're not like, but this guy was. He was in Chechnya. And he did command men directly in Syria when he had his tour of duty there.
Yes, and his main claim
Um,
to fame is military intelligence, GRU.
yes, and so, but he is the deputy of one of the negotiators in Dubai. Now, of course, the assassination attempt happens during the negotiations, which means America is not serious about the negotiations, which means Europe is not serious about the negotiations, right? You literally just can't believe them. They're not serious. They're not happy with the terms. And now Alexeyev did nearly die. He was almost killed by a man, a Ukrainian, who was living in Russia but had moved from Ukraine. Can you imagine like how many of these spies and infiltrators have gone in there since the outbreak of the war following the SMO?
And it really is in that situation, damned if you do, damned if you don't, because the Russians understandably want to have this narrative that the Ukrainians are brother people under the foot of the
Yes,
Kiev regime, in which case you would think extending a hand to said Ukrainians, in which case millions of Ukrainians have gone to Russia and have lived just completely normal lives, don't get me wrong. But
yeah,
you do get more incidents than you should be comfortable with of these subverters
yes,
getting through poor security.
right. And that the lack in security is really, really astounding. And this guy lived in one of the Moscow suburbs in an apartment complex. Like it's amazing that he doesn't have the security that he needs. Obviously, he is very high profile. He is very important, and his would be assassin has been caught. And if I'm not mistaken, he was caught in the UAE. So like, what was he doing? Like, was he flying back to report? I don't know. But he dressed as a woman, one of these cleaning women. I've in my times that I've gone to Russia, you noticed them. And so he's dressed up as one of these women who like sweep the areas, public areas and whatnot, and pick up garbage and so on. And uh, Alexeyev was shot, I believe, in the hand once. The only reason he got shot in the chest is this guy's over 60, and he got into a brawl with this guy, and that's how the gun went off and hit him in the chest. But initially, it I think it might have hit him in the foot and then the hand, but he still wanted to fight this guy. So he survived, and he was fully conscious just a few hours after the operation and everything, and he was cognizant, and for all intents and purposes, he's fine. He's going to survive quite easily. But and as I said, the assassin or would-be assassin has been caught. But that tells you that the Americans are not they're not serious about this. It's kind of like the games that they play with the Iranians. Uh, what they want is regime change, and they want some stupid, faggoty ass Shah, the kind that they used to have, running Iran. And it's the same thing with Russia. What they want is Russia divided into 10 different countries, and America, global homo, just rules the world forever. That is what they want, right? And that's why they're squeezing Europe. That's why they're squeezing all their allies to help them as much as possible, because the way they see it, the way they've gamed this out for the next 10 years, if they don't do this, their power is going to be greatly diminished. And that's why everything that is happening right now.
Well, let me take the opportunity to bring up.
But I wanted to make just one more point
Yes,
with
please do.
Alexiev, only because Lavrov gave an interview recently, and it's surprising that Lavrov is not part of the negotiations. And based on what Lavrov is saying, you could argue that he's not happy, not only with the way the negotiations have been going, but maybe even with the Russian negotiators. He never says that. I should stress that, right? And it's not like, I mean, Putin has said it like for years before the SMO, that with America, it doesn't matter who's elected. They're dealing with the same issues, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or Republican. Foreign issues that are not dramatically changed based on who's president or which party is in power. So, but nonetheless, you can see that Lavrov is frustrated with the negotiation process. It's not working. And particularly after the attempt on Putin's life, the second attempt on Putin's life, of course, he was in a helicopter that narrowly escaped being hit in the Kursk region last year or the year before. I can't remember whether it was like early 2025 or late 2024.
I think it was late 2024. I know exactly.
I think you're right.
About.
Yeah. So there is a frustration. I think I could be wrong, but he's very candid. That could also be strategic that he is saying this, that Lavrov is given this interview and is there to indicate where Russia is through less formal means, if those formal means are defined as the negotiators in Dubai. And, it's a deadlock anyways. Nothing happened. No one expected anything to happen anyways. So, and there were these rumors that Russia was going to return to the dollar if, of course, this has been debunked. The TASS news agency said this is not true. It's the same thing when there was another deal between the Russians and the Indians. Russia's flooded with hundreds of thousands. You have to understand this disinformation warfare is constant, but it's it hits new ticks when you can tarnish Russia's kind of reputation in the West amongst the right wing, right? And
mind you, it's two-pronged, where Russia is a third worldist, Islamist, whatever country. When you're trying to bait the right wing, they'll go to the Muslims and say, look what the Russians did to the Chechens. Russia's an Islamophobic empire like the rest of the Western countries, blah, blah, blah. They'll go to the left wingers, say, look, Putin's a far-right dictator who hates the LGBTQ CIA. It is such a multi-pronged approach that you have to realize whenever you hear any of these stories, it's likely none of them are true.
Yes. So anyways, I just noticed all these rumors always pop up when something isn't going right for America and the West. They always pop up, and this is sort of the latest. But you had a point. I just wanted to mention, the things that Lavrov has said, his frustrations, and why isn't he part of the diplomacy mission for a ceasefire or for resolving the war, and why is it just usually generals, et cetera, et cetera? I don't know. I mean, there could be reasons I haven't even thought of, right? I don't know.
Could be a number of things, and I'm not going to.
He is outspoken.
Yes,
but I think him being allowed to be outspoken is an indication. It's not like the Russians conceded anything in Dubai, right? Putin made his demands very clear in June of 2024, and he hasn't budged from there.
arguably foolishly not demanding more as the war continues on, as the Ukrainians have less negotiating power. But I mean, I maintain to this day, if the West really wanted to screw over Russia in the long term, accept the 2024 terms. Because Putin comes home with those, nobody is satisfied. He loses.
Even if he got the 4 regions plus Crimea?
I would say so. I would say that I think a significant amount of the Russian populace would think that with all the blood and treasure we poured into this war, it's simply not enough. Why is Odessa still in the hands of the Banderites? Why is the rump state of Ukraine left in this quote-unquote neutral position that it was in when the Maidan happened? And
Right.
I think that a significant amount of the Russian populace and also a significant amount of the Russian elite would be asking those questions of Putin, and that if you want to delegitimize Putin, take his deal. It's just that simple.
Right. You could also make the argument that he knows that the Americans are not going to go for the deal.
That is true. That he is putting it out there as the reasonable position, so he can go to the more neutral countries, like say in India or Brazil, and say, "Look, we're reasonable. Look, we're trying to be diplomatic." But it's the other side. It's the Ukrainians and their American and European sponsors who spit on every negotiation attempt. In which case,
Yeah, because
yes,
this
he
war
has
has
the
been
point.
decades in the making, and the Americans thought it would be over by now.
Oh, absolutely. Like it's. I mean, speaking of decades in the making, I'll take this as the opportunity to mention our first Epstein files case, where I have to say, despite my very mixed views on Putin over the years, I mean, you can go back through the show archives. There's times where I've talked very highly of him. There's times where I've criticized him pretty harshly. But I did gain a new level of respect for him in a certain way as a result of the Epstein files. Now, of course, they'll have you believe Epstein was a Russian spy, etc., etc., etc. As we all know, the Russian tradition is to be buried on the Mount of Olives. The Russian tradition is to own an IDF sweatshirt. The Russian tradition is to use a certain G slur. No, not that one. Another one for people who are a different ethnicity and or religion than you. Those are all very Russian words. And of course, this word, it also has a Russian origin. Not a Hebrew origin, not a Yiddish origin. No, don't be ridiculous. However, virtually all the times Putin was mentioned in the Epstein files was either A, him being Epstein being rebuffed by Putin, or B, Epstein and his friends seething and coping that Putin's still in power and meeting with Russian opposition leader of the day. The one
Pomarev, he was kind of like, I mean, he was in Russia. He was part of the Duma. Then he fled to Ukraine, and he's got some kind of a connection with that RDK. You know, the half Jewish guy who's leading all those based Russian right wingers and Ukrainians and based Westoid right wingers. You know, meeting up with the Golden One and all other such nonsense. Pomarev?
Yes.
Something. Yeah.
If you want a view
That's
of him,
the guy that he's like, we got to get Pomarev. We got to get oust. This is back in like 2011.
imagine Navalny but gayer.
Yeah. You know, and he's thinking like maybe we can get Pomarev to or Pomarev. I forget exactly how his last name was. You know, to become the new president of Russia. And yeah, you're right. He was rebuffed for years. Putin literally never wrote him at all.
Yeah, and same thing. Lavrov was also mentioned several times, but they were also just seething about Lavrov, refusing to meet with him. What's interesting is we actually talked about one of the drop site articles that Netanyahu, if you remember when he shared that piece from Jacobin, a quote unquote left wing magazine. Funny enough, with that back in November, December, sometime towards the end of last year, talking about that one of the first batches of Epstein files being released. In that, once again, there were allegations that Epstein tried to use back channels to get the Russians to abandon Syria. So this has been going on for a number of years. But like I said, I'll take the first opportunity to mention the Epstein files. that he despised Putin because just even the small amount of resistance Putin has put up compared to what he even could back then was enough to enrage this guy. And I want you to think about something because I've been thinking about this ever since it came out. One of the other things is he talked about the Maidan, great opportunity. You saw most of the trafficking routes came from Eastern Europe, particularly in the time after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the general political, economic, and social destabilization there. Like I said, after the Maidan, he called it a great opportunity. Ukraine was one of the main sources for these trafficked children. And I want you to consider that the ICC has a warrant out for Putin's arrest for removing children from Ukraine when we know, based on these files, Ukraine was one of their favorite hubs
Yes.
to get, let's just say, their product, to put it in, let's just say, less horrifying terms. And Putin has to wear the brand of war criminal because he evacuated these 40,000 children from not only a war zone, but a war zone
But that Western pedos couldn't touch.
Yeah, exactly.
And he'll never be forgiven for it.
No, he will never be forgiven for protecting the children of his nation. Which you look at these children that were taken; these are ethnic Russians. These are his co-ethnics. They aren't just Ukrainian children. They are ethnic Russian children who lived in Ukraine, and he will never be forgiven for depriving them of a fresh source, as it were.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what do I know? Clearly, it's all kabuki theater. It's all controlled opposite. There's literally no sides to anything. Everything is a stage play. Everything is controlled opposition. The war in Ukraine isn't even happening right now. You see that's how you know it's serious analysis, where you just embrace the literal nothing ever happens. That literally everything is fake. It's not that, wow, some people, even if they have moral failings in other places, even if they aren't perfect, even if there are very legitimate criticisms of these people, might actually stand in the way of their nations and total depravity. No, that doesn't exist. That just never happens.
Yeah. I mean, I remember even before the stories from the West, right? I remember, of course, there's a classic article by The Guardian from 2023 about a Ukrainian dad that went and got his son from Russia. And they're doing tourist photos in front of the chapel for Saint Basil on Red Square. Like, does this look to you like a guy who was afraid that his child would be hurt? No, they stopped your child from being killed. Or, because this is the part that I remember reading about before I saw this article, there were reports of Ukrainian children, these are from Western sources, disappearing in Europe, right? And we know that, you know, most of the women that, and children, boys and girls, that Epstein abused or had his clients abuse were all from Eastern Europe, right? You can look at the disgusting fashion photos of like young boys, like boys not even in puberty, that were used for like one of the fashion labels. This is like way back in 2022. I remember discovering this. I was like horrified. But this is the kind of shit that like always happens in the West. So yeah, he saved them from that, exactly.
And then there's also the case, going back to Yugoslavia, a lot of the Western proxies, particularly in Bosnia and Albania, were not only selling Serbian children, but their own children to
Yes.
Epstein and his clientele.
Yeah, I mean, they like, look, Ukraine had the reputation even before the Maidan coup of being like the place where, you had women, surrogate moms, who would give anybody like the child to, including like gay men in the West.
Oh, I remember at the start of the war, March, April 2022, all the sob stories of, me and my husband, of course, a man's writing, and
Oh
his
yeah,
quote
yeah,
unquote
me and my
husband.
husband.
We couldn't get our surrogate child because of Putin's unprovoked war in Ukraine.
Give me a break.
Yeah, it's and it.
Pathetic.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, it's disgusting.
regardless of whatever happened in the Soviet Union. I'm not here to absolve the Soviet Union of every wrongdoing. I have a very nuanced view on that I've gone over too many times that I'm not going to repeat myself here. Ukraine was never the literal brothel that it is today, figurative and literal. The mail order brides of Eastern Europe that were a punchline in the 1990s and 2000s. A lot of those came from Ukraine. I'm not saying they didn't come from Russia. I'm not saying they didn't come from other parts of Eastern Europe.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Ukraine was once again a hotspot for that. I remember an article from The Guardian, I think it was. Don't quote me on that. One of these European liberal publications about how about half the women in these legal German brothels, because Germany does have some legal form of prostitution, were of Ukrainian origin. And it's, once again, this is the design they have for your nations, especially if you're an Eastern European nation, especially if you're Russia. This is what the opposition has in hold for you. And even if you are in a Western nation, they only think slightly higher of you. Because they'll do the same to you, they'll do the same to your children after they've had their fun. The only reason they don't do it to you is because it was easier to smuggle people out of Ukraine. It was easier to establish those criminal networks in the former Soviet Union and in the former Eastern Bloc. But the minute it's just as easy to do it in your home, in your neighborhood, you're next. Your children are next. Your loved ones are next. That is, like I said, they only slightly think higher of you, and that's even pushing it. And it's more so a procedural matter, the reason they haven't done it to you and yours.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to not care about these people, and I don't. There's more to cover, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much. But then there's the question of like, oh well, I don't care about that. I mean, what about the grooming gangs in the UK? I'll give you a little hint here. They all spring from the same fountain. The reason there are grooming gangs in every major city in the UK is because the people in those files, no matter how quote unquote base they are, either directly or indirectly facilitated those people in your country. Yes, the same people who have a fanatical support for Israel and all of its doings, as we've said, as countless other people have said, are also the same people who both indirectly and directly facilitate mass migration into your home, into your neighborhood, into your country.
Yeah.
And there's simply no dichotomy to be had. And I'm preempting myself a bit here because I want to talk about this a bit later in the show, but I figure I'm on the topic. I'll get back to Europe in a minute here. I just want to express a few things about this. I'm not advocating you take any action. Once again, my position has always been on the show. I talk about my opinions. You talk about your opinions. We let the audience say what they want to. We don't advocate any action one way or another. Number one, for legal reasons. Number two, I trust you, the audience, to be smart enough to make your own decisions. But I think this should show everyone, just with these files, that there's simply no recourse. And you could argue I'm being a hypocrite even recording the show right now. Well, if there's no recourse, why are you doing it? Well, I've said many times, I like to think this is a historical project just as much as I do a political project. And that and it helps me work through my own thoughts. You guys seem to enjoy it. That's why I'm here. I've said this many times. But it should show that no matter what based candidate they put up in 2028 or whenever the next election in your country is, it doesn't matter. When you have Steve Bannon in the same email chain as Noam Chomsky, there is no political distinctions. There's nothing. And that these people, even if there are, say, legitimate people out there who might do good for their countries, these movements get subverted. Even Orban, who I've spoken highly of, and I do have a somewhat high opinion of, uh, I mean, he has associations with Bannon, not directly with Epstein as far as I know, but even when there are people who are on the right track, they are still surrounded by subversives, and their effectiveness is degraded because of that. And like I said, it sort of destroys the illusion when the most far right man and the most far left man in American politics can be in the same email chain snickering over some of the most debauched behavior that you could even imagine.
Yeah, I sent you some slides of the I think this is an Italian company, like clothing company. You can see just how like I literally cannot show you the other stuff.
Yeah,
The other stuff
I
I
don't
have on file
I don't
is even racier.
I do not even want to take the risk of showing this on screen. But
Right.
it's as bad as you imagine. Let me just put that. Look it up if you'd like to.
And it's like literally Czech Center in New York. Baby, I like it raw.
Ugh.
This was a show from March 2nd to April 4th, 2017. This is from I believe, the Kiev Post, the
Yeah,
gorsadkiev.com.
yeah.
Like
Go there
that's
if you want to subject yourself to it.
yeah. Look, we're so Western.
Let me just say, I'll try to give an audio description so you guys don't have to look at it, and so I don't put the channel at risk. Two boys, no shirts, plastic bags over their head, and I don't know. I would say around 9 or 10. Another boy looks pretty emaciated, also no shirt. Devil horns and a pitchfork. And then another boy, I would say he looks slightly older, maybe 11 or 12. You guessed it, no shirt. Holding a rabbit in a very uncomfortable position with these weird, like, red wings on his back. Yeah, that's one of them.
That's one of the ones I cannot. We can't
yeah.
show it. That's the kind of stupid shit that they've done. Like cry me more about like Putin. Give me a break.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, if any normal person had these pictures, and not from the Kiev Post, like they would rightfully be investigated. But because it's the Kiev Post, which is getting its money from NGOs from across North America and Europe, it's stunning and brave. And like I said, this is what they want to do to your children. And the only thing stopping them is procedural. It's just easier to do it to the Ukrainian children. There's no distinction to be drawn. They think of you as cattle all the same. Need I point out one of the other scandals that came out of the Epstein files while I'm on the topic is the fact that the financial crisis in Europe among the PIGS countries, I saw the files particularly for Greece, but I am going to extrapolate and assume that the other Southern European countries that had a financial crisis on top of 2008 in the mid-2010s, it wasn't even their financial crisis. It's that they were being tax farmed to bail out organizations like Deutsche Bank, who made bad investments on the behalf of Epstein and his clients.
Yes.
This is what they view from your nation. And the only reason that your nation wasn't driven into a fake debt crisis and tax farmed was procedural. Like I said, it's not that they have some special exemption for you if you were under that delusion. It's the fact that it's harder to do that in Germany. It's harder to do that in France. It's harder to do that in the United States. And that these peripheral countries in Europe, it's easier to tax farm them. And that the minute they can do it to you, they will do it to you.
Yeah.
But, yeah, but you know who's actually been most affected by this, and this does segue somewhat into my European news, is Keir Starmer and his buddies. It seems like he's the one, him and Mandelson and all these people among the British establishment that are really taking the brunt for it. And that's not to mention the former Prince Andrew, I believe he's Mountbatten Windsor now is his official name. Funny enough, you go back to Mountbatten, he was also involved in some very illicit things in Northern Ireland back in the 80s. And let's just say met his a very fiery end that one could argue may or may not have been deserved, depending on your point of view on the matter. So I guess it runs in the family with that. But it looks like Starmer's government, not that he was particularly popular in the first place. He's
the most unpopular British prime minister in British history.
Yeah, since they've ever kept records on that. It's most unpopular British leaders since they've kept records on popularity of leaders. That's what we're talking about. So him being one of the scapegoats, him being one of the sacrificial lambs, is not a surprise. I'm sure they'll probably dig out a few more in the near future. Maybe on the other side of the pond. Maybe after the midterms, if the Republicans fare particularly badly, maybe Trump will be thrown under the bus and that he'll have the ultimate end to his legacy. I'm not saying they'll impeach him, not saying they'll remove him from office, but maybe they'll destroy what's left of his time in office as one of these sacrificial lambs. And that, while what we have to keep in mind is when people quote unquote face justice for this, if Starmer were to be forced to resign, or Mandelson if he actually faced any real consequences, it is the same people. It is their partners in crime prosecuting them. And that these are the ones who have been selected, been thrown under the bus. And that they will make you think that some justice has been done, even though in a way, yes, it has. But they will expect you to be satisfied with these breadcrumbs while they continue to maintain the same system that they've maintained for decades. But expect you to be grateful and kiss their feet because we got rid of some of the ones on the edge who nobody really liked anyway.
Yeah.
But that's the crux of what I had for Epstein. Like I said, it came up. It's out of the way. So I'll pivot on to some European news, which I don't want to focus on too much. But Starmer went to China, and I was assured it was a very successful visit. Anglo-Sino relations or Sino-Anglo relations. I'm not sure what direction that you'd actually put that in. Anglo-Chinese. It's very strange trying to figure out how you'd term that one. But in all seriousness, this was simply an attempt to make the U.S. sweat because of the minor quibbles, all things considered, between the U.S. and Europe right now. The U.K. aligning itself more with Europe, or what some might speculate, trying to build the globalist system without America, which I think is a harebrained idea, both in reality and both in conception, the fact that they would even try to do something like that. But I would say, honestly, I'm more concerned, not too concerned, but I think there's more of a concern that China is the one being lured into a trap rather than the other way around. I mean, look no further than the Russian frozen assets. Let's say that China is compelled to dump billions in investment in the European markets and in the UK markets. And let's say there's some sort of conflict involving Taiwan. Are we going to be looking at $300 billion in frozen Chinese assets that go to Taiwan? And I would imagine, and I'm almost certain, that the Chinese leadership are smart enough not to step in that. I'm not saying there'll be no agreements. I'm not saying that the U.S. won't be made to sweat even just a little bit. But I think even just from the perspective that nobody's looking at, the fact that I think China is wise enough to see through this. That no,
Yes,
they're not.
Which
They're not
reminds
going.
me of.
Go ahead.
Reminds me of one of the Epstein files. The Chinese are in a meeting. He happens to be there, and Epstein had a guy that was fluent in Chinese, and he overhears the Chinese saying, "Be careful of the Jewish dog." Remember what's his name? Jiang, like that, the fake Chinese. I remember him.
Yeah.
On Twitter. Oh my God, he would. I am tired. Transgender mental illness.
Broken branch.
Oh my God, when China annexes the United States, I hope that the glorious CCP will expel all white women directly to the sun. You knew it was just a white guy. But, anyways, I just thought it literally was like like a Zhang Yang post. Oh my God.
Oh yeah, he is not allowed. It's just that simple.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. People ask Zhang, why talk poor English? Attend Michigan University? I refuse to take English class. Everyone speak Mandarin by end of century. F you.
Yeah, those. Yeah, but I'd forgotten about the comments that the Chinese had made going into their meeting with one of let's just say Epstein's people. Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, he's not wrong. You can't say he's wrong. But I think just judging on that alone, they're wise enough not to play into, let's just say, Europe's very symbolic rebellion against the American Empire that isn't ultimately going to amount to anything. However, that does lead me into the question of the Munich Security Conference, which started today, the 13th of February, that as we're recording. You'll hear this over the weekend, so it will be a little bit more underway when we get there. Unlike J.D. Vance from last year, who gave his rather critical speech to the Europeans, and I do have to say, while I do not trust Vance, I know what interest he represents. I did take a mild amount of satisfaction last year into him feuding with some of the bureaucrats, although I realized ultimately meaningless, but I can still enjoy some of the theatrics of it, and don't get me wrong. In contrast to that, showing the position, instead of sending Vance again, who you would think that we would send if we were really in such a dispute with the Europeans, we send Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham. So clearly a much more amicable delegation. And Lindsey Graham, the eunuch in Munich, as I've titled this section in my notes, he spent his entire time kvetching about Iran, naturally. And just here's some of the select quotes. It is a religious theocracy that if they could get a nuclear weapon, they would use it to advance 3 goals: purify Islam, destroy Israel, and come after us.
Oh God.
Further
How stupid do you have to be?
Further comments on Iran. You can't say keep protesting, we got your back, help is on the way, and then nothing happens. And any deal about Iran has to come from the Senate. I'm not going to bless a bad deal. We might not have Lindsey Graham's blessing. We got to watch out for that one. Saying the statement simply, if somebody had killed Hitler in 1935, we probably would have been better. Getting all the classics in. Talking about the rightful Shah, Reza Pahlavi, Iran. If they screw it up, they screw it up. I'd rather give them a chance because I know what I'm getting with the Ayatollahs.
No.
Oh, and then finally on Saudi Arabia and their current dispute with the United Arab Emirates. Be smart, knock it off, Saudi Arabia, knock it off. I'm tired of this crap. Lindsey Graham is tired of your crap, so you better beware. But that was Lindsey Graham. The other speech that happened today was Macron's, in which case, some people might not read it this way, but I read it this way. He suggested, in order to stabilize Europe's economy, that they expand their industrial base to kidney smuggling. Read, and I quote, I see so many friends from the Western Balkans and Moldova here. They want to join the EU because they know the value of this approach. We are too shy to say, we are starting not to believe in ourselves, which was a huge mistake. And then he goes on to kvetch about Putin. Mind you, this is just a couple days after mulling over sending his national security advisor to the quote-unquote peace talks with the Russians. Russia, after invading Ukraine, is a weakened country. It's isolated economically. It's completely dependent on China. Funny they say that, well, like they the Chinese boogeyman who wants to economically colonize everyone, while we're sending our people over to negotiate with China because we're in a domestic dispute with the Americans, allegedly. Just ignore that. I don't see any evidence the Russians want to find a nice peace now. And finally saying, today if we engage and send troops on the ground in Ukraine, we take the responsibility of escalation. We don't have any consensus to do so. We would be responsible for triggering a loss of control from the situation. So he brings it to the brink and then walks it back ever so slightly. And then finally, arguably my favorite, Alexander Stubb of Finland gave a speech. And I have to say, I respect Stubb more than any other Finnish politician by virtue of him being ethnically Swedish and putting Finland in its rightful place. But I digress. A few comments he had made. He, Putin, wanted to make Ukraine Russian. It became European. He wanted to prevent NATO expansion. He has got Finland and Sweden in NATO. He wanted us to cut our defense spending. Now it's going to rise to 5%. When this war began, Russia ceded 12% of Ukrainian territory. That was 12 years ago. Since then, it's 8. Over the past 2 years, it's 1%. In December, Ukraine managed to kill 34,000 Russian soldiers. They haven't managed to replace them with new soldiers. Just keep doing what you're doing. Eventually, you'll prevail and win this war. coming from noted ethnic Swede Alexander Stubb. Like I said, I will always respect him for being ethnically Swedish and ruling Finland, because I'm tired of trying to pronounce Finnish politician names. But the only Uralic language I'm going to give the time of day is Hungarian. I've made that abundantly clear on this program, and that Finland, one could say I have some negative opinions towards, but I digress. But that was the breakdown of at least the first part of the day, because it's ongoing, of the Munich Security Conference. I'm eager for Rubio's speech. I'm sure it'll be as fake and G-slur as ever. But you had something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that Rubio was supposed to meet other European leaders or delegates for European leaders, and at the last moment, he just left. At the last minute, he says, "Oh, I have rescheduling. I have to reschedule. I have scheduling issues I wasn't aware of." I mean, obviously, it's a lie. So why is he doing that?
Well, I also like the ongoing saga between him and Kaya Kallas, where she simply cannot speak to Rubio under any circumstances. Nobody wants to speak to the greatest Estonian to ever live, Kaya Kallas. I can't believe it. It's sad. I'm sad to hear that. She deserves more. It is also funny. Another piece of news I saw while I was on vacation, because I did check my phone every once in a while. Don't get me wrong. Is that her and Ursula apparently are not getting along anymore, and that she was writing Ursula off as a dictator. And I've never been more conflicted on whose side to take here. And I think I'm gonna say it. This might destroy the program. This might make you log off right now and quit and never speak to me again. I might have to come down on Kaya Kallas' side.
Oh, wow.
I can't believe it. I'm siding with the Estonian. Hey, speaking of Uralic languages, hey, Estonia. Like I said, and people wonder why. It really is. It is strange to think of this language family, of this broader, one could even argue ethnic family, but I'll get into that in just a moment while I'm on this tangent. Why do they only produce one serious nation? And I'm not talking in a contemporary sense, even though it does apply in a contemporary sense, but even in a historical sense. It's like, what is Finnish history? What is Estonian history? Especially when you compare it to Hungarian history. Like, Hungary was once the bulwark against Turkish influence in Europe. Now, I know the history is more complicated than that. I'm not going to paint a one-dimensional picture here. But why? And I would argue, because you look at the actual genetic breakdown of Hungarians, they're mostly Germanic and Slavic. They just so happen
Yes.
to speak a Uralic language, and that's similar to it. That's true to an extent in Estonia and Finland, but they're much more Uralic. Although the Uralic people inside of Russia, and perhaps because of the Russian influence, are much more sane. But there's just something about, maybe it's that combination of that people and that climate that just makes them deranged. Maybe Hungarians being a few hundred miles south and having better food, much better food. Maybe that fixed them. But they are a bizarre. I don't even want to say ethnic group, but a bizarre agglomeration of peoples. In which case, we see, even to this day, even the year of our Lord 2026, at least in a European context, only managed to produce one worth speaking about. But I've been waiting to get that rant out for a while, so thank you for indulging my ramblings.
No, that's quite okay. Yeah, I mean, I all of this that's happening right now, I wonder how much of it is like Rubio leaves at the last minute. How much of this is fakery, right? Like, I mean, what's not fake is somebody trying to kill Alexeyev, right? That's not fake. That's just not the Ukrainians doing it, right? America has had dozens of CIA bases in Ukraine since 2014. They've been there for 12 years, right? And everybody knows about their program, after World War II. America has known since the 50s that if there would ever be like a civil war that could undo Russia, it would start in Ukraine. One of the reasons why they stopped dropping off these guys, in Western Ukraine, and the New Yorker had an article in 2022 about this, and or it might have been the New York Times. It was either New Yorker or the New York Times, where they said, weekend edition, they said 75% of them were literally never heard of after they were dropped off. You drop 4 guys, 3 guys you will never hear from again. That night, after that night.
Oh yeah. I
And
do.
they did this for 10 years, and it was fruitless. It just went on for too long.
I do have to say, however, in regards to the question of a civil war, Russia and Ukraine, something interesting about Alexeyev that has gotten overlooked is that he was born and raised in Venetia, which is Western Ukraine. And
Yes.
I'm sure, obviously, being in service of the Russian state in the position that he was, he saw himself as an ethnic Russian. But it does create a much more clouded view of the ethnic differences between Russians and Ukrainians. We did discuss this before. You talked about that one time where there was the, I think you'd said you were somewhere in Western Canada, about the monument to the people who were both Russian and Ukrainian, and even from like the far reaches of Western Ukraine, from Galicia, and that even going back prior to World War One, even among the Galicia, even among the Uniate populations, there was a sense of belonging to a broader overarching nation, the same one as the Russians, and I think a lot of that has died out. But
Mm-hmm.
the fact, I don't know, you had a man from Western Ukraine try to assassinate another man from Western Ukraine, both on different sides of this conflict that we're supposed to believe are between these diametrically opposed nations. When no, this is a civil war. We've said it many times before. We're not the only ones. We're far from the only ones to say that, but it is a civil war through and through. And I think the biggest takeaway from the Alexeyev case, aside from the fact that it shows any attempts at diplomacy are completely disingenuous, is that it creates an existential question for Russia in the sense of what is the role of Ukraine post-war? Because, as I had mentioned earlier, rightfully there's many who see the Ukrainians as a brother people, think that, well, yes, they should be able to come here. They are us. They are our people. If some of them view them as brother people, some of them view a significant portion of the population as outright ethnic Russians, in which case, in many cases, they are correct. And as I said before, there are several million Ukrainians who have come to Russia since the 2014 crisis, who have lived their lives as ethnic Russians or people just living normally in Russian society. But you have an uncomfortable amount of people like this would-be assassin, like many of the people who have participated in terrorist attacks or other sabotage operations who have come from Ukraine, that forced the Russians to implement a militarized border against what is ultimately their own people, because there are so many subversive elements there. And it's a question there's no easy answer to at this point. And one would hope at the end of this war there can be some sort of proper reconciliation and integration of these people, regardless of what the borders might look like at the end of it. But I fear that's going to be a problem for years to come. That you
generations.
That even among the populations that millions upon millions of people that they brought in from Ukraine, while I'm sure many of them will live their lives and their future generations will be ethnic Russians, in many ways they run the risk, and I think we're starting to see the manifestation of that, of a real fifth column developing Russian society, not only in the hinterlands, not only in the borderlands, Ukraine, but in the heart of Russia at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And as to what the solution to that is, I have no idea. I mean, they've kept the
Yeah.
Chechens pacified for this long, so one would think that surely this can't be too much of a challenge. But I think the similarity arguably makes the situation more dangerous. Like, even if this doesn't explode into some sort of civil conflict and some sort of low level insurgency, whatever it might be, they one of the other ways the West could accomplish its goals is that they create a permanent sense of distrust. Even these people have Russian names, they speak Russian. Um, Even if their ancestors came from Ukraine like 3 or 4 generations ago, there's always going to be that level of distrust. Are you a fifth columnist? Are you Ukrainian loyalist? Are you a
Hmm.
bandit? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even if they don't get the kind of social unrest they want in terms of sabotage operations, in terms of criminal operations, they can still break down the social fabric that way.
Yes. My own belief is that the prospect of Ukrainians and Russians working this out. I'm not talking about here, let's say, relationships between Russians and Ukrainians here or in America or Europe, but I mean there, in the actual heartland. I think this is multi generations. I don't. It may never even happen. I think the severing is at least a century. I don't know. That maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. My friend is baffled by this whole thing. He doesn't understand, like, why are they fighting when they have so much in common? And I said, it's often the case that, when you have two very similar people, entities, but there's only one entity available for both of them, they will war over who gets that. Now, it could be between brothers over, uh, some kind of inheritance in a more traditional society. It could be something else, but often it'll be even more intense. And I don't know if it'll ever properly heal. You could look back and say that it was always sort of up and down, but I don't think in the history of the Russian and Ukrainian people something like this has happened. And you know, we think about those Ukrainians in Kiev that are living underground, men avoiding being pulled off the street, but also people trying to survive in the cold. Um, how are they going to remember this? Um, they don't care. I mean, they never cared what the right wing death squads from Western Ukraine were doing to the people in Donbass. I mean, even the West has articles, like the New York Times, about Western mercenaries and the RDK and other Ukrainian battalions who murdered hundreds of people in Kursk and put them in mass grave. Hundreds, including children. Well, I mean, they were doing that in Donbass in 2014, anyways, right? And blowing up the churches and y- you know shooting the icons and whatnot. Like, also Conrad from World War Now was on Cleave to. I didn't know about this channel, Cleave to Antiquity. I think something like that. Anyways, he was on the show, and of course, Conrad was in Donbass, and he was shown churches that were in the no man's land, and you can see that the Ukrainian side was like riddled with bullets and mortar, and the Russian side had a few. And that is emblematic of the way these sides have behaved. Ukraine has really decided to go for all or nothing. They really have all or nothing. They get it all back. Russia's destroyed, or we die. I don't know.
Oh yeah, complete scorched earth. And I've said many times since the beginning of this war, is there any demand the Russians have made that would be worse than complete annihilation, which seems to be the path that they're on. And the way you could look at this, and some might argue that this is far too pro-Russia view of mine, is that the invitation has always been to be a brother people, or to be the same people as a powerful state, as an empire, as a country that can leave its mark in the world, that can protect its people. And of course, I'm not saying it's perfect. With all the caveats that, yes, there are problems in Russia, etc., etc., etc. You all know this already. Or to be a rump state that is constantly traded back and forth between empires, to be viewed as the cannon fodder whenever the Western powers want to wage war on Russia. And it seems that they've managed to convince enough people that the latter is somehow more preferable to the former, by bringing up and sometimes even fabricating historical grievances. I mean, of what concern is the 1932-1933 famine, commonly known as the Holodomor, to somebody whose grandparents or great-grandparents lived in Lvov, which was under Polish occupation at the time? Of what concern is a famine in eastern Ukraine that primarily affected ethnic Russians?
These are mostly people in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah. And
I mean, thousands of Serbs moved there a century and a half earlier. Like, what are you even talking about? Right? Not to mention, like, the famine that occurred in southern Russia and Kazakhstan. Like, kulaks weren't Ukrainian. Kulaks were anybody who was hoarding food, right? Who wanted to be, these people were not, like, these people had more property than peasants. And when they didn't want to share it, they literally burned their crops and killed their cows. I'm like, I'm not making an argument for the communist revolution, but it was those MFs in the West and they're Jewish cohorts at the time who foisted this on Russia, and they were very happy to do that. It didn't bother them. It has never bothered them. That Jews profited from this, as long as they had an upper hand on them. It's why that there was an opium trade in China. It didn't bother them that the Sassoon family got fabulously wealthy, as long as it enriched them as well. They never have. They're not paragons of any morality. They're not helpless victims of propaganda. Give me a break, right?
No, you're correct.
They foisted this on Russia in the first place. But let's be honest, okay? You plundered Russia after World War I, right? During the time of the Russian Revolution, right? And these kulaks were doing that. They were denying the food for everybody, okay? And a kulak isn't a Ukrainian. It's anybody who was doing this.
Yes.
Which only popularized and strengthened the communists. It only made their points. That's what was so tragic about it.
And to continue on to their point, that you did not see any concern about Russia falling into the hands of communism until the Russians reconstituted themselves with the communist system in spite of the communist system. Until you had somebody like Stalin or like Brezhnev who could actually wield the organs of the state, and I'm not going to say a pro-Russian way necessarily, because it's a lot more nuanced than that, but in a way that was not to the absolute detriment to the Russian nation. And like I said, well, you could argue that in many ways,
because that's what they wanted, was the absolute destruction of the Russian nation.
Yes. And like I said,
that is how they've always been for hundreds of years.
And there's a lot of things you can say about the Soviet system where, like, it wasn't necessarily to the benefit of the Russians, but point being is, it was not to the absolute destruction of them either, which is why you had this global crusade against communism, which is why you had them shaking hands with Mao to get one over on the Russians, which is why you had them working with Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan, any group of people you can imagine to get one over, because the goal of communism was to destroy Russia. the Russians were able to reconstitute themselves in spite of that, and then they decided we need this global crusade against communism.
Damn it, communism didn't work. What do we do now?
Yeah,
Let's be anti-communist.
yeah. Let's recruit Trotsky and his disciples because we care so much about stopping communism. These people who are probably more closer to the version laid out by Marx and Lenin than Joseph Stalin ever was. Like that's how much they cared about stopping communism, that they were willing to side with probably the more ideologically consistent communists if it meant getting one over in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
that's and these people expect you to take anything and everything they say seriously, and then they dig up these corpses to wave them in front of you, and now we have to care about Venezuela and Cuba, states that only have, I would say, marginal Russian and Chinese influence. I'm not saying it's non-existent, but point being is they wanted to dig up these Cold War corpses and make you think that we're on the brink of another Cuban Missile Crisis, despite the fact that just about everything else we've done has contributed to that. But the existence of some Latin American socialists who run their country probably in the same way as a lot of their right-wing counterparts do, just contrary to certain interests, that's the concern. It's not the fact that left and right Latin American countries have facilitated the migration of their dregs society into the United States, where the United States government has gladly accepted millions of them for decades, in between occasional crackdowns to make you think they take it seriously. It's the fact that whatever clown is in charge of Venezuela or was in charge of Venezuela uses too many red slogans. And do they care about that? Do they care about the actual effects of that? Do they care about any way that it might impact you? No, it's just this. It's this deranged way to make you feel like the government's doing something for you by stopping these damn dirty Reds down south, when realistically, like I said, they're not. It's not curbing the migration flow. It's not stopping the flow of jobs out of the country. It's not stopping any of the issues. It's not stopping your replacement, but you get to feel good for a few minutes.
Yeah. It's like we joke like, America's has this incredibly well-armed populace that is incapable of another revolution. And then anytime their government conquers another country or subjugates another country, they forget their ills that they have with their government. How many times? I mean, I'm in my late 50s. How many times I've seen this? It's honestly mind-boggling. That's why, like, I don't expect things that men half my age expect.
I mean, they talk about bread and circuses, but it turns out the people are satisfied with mere breadcrumbs. Why would they give us any more?
Yeah.
And I mean, like I said, I don't condone what these people do. Not even anything approximating that. But how many more times are you going to let them do the song and dance? How many more times are you going to sit by and pretend like this game is being played and that there might be a result that benefits you in any way before you say, sorry, we're not playing anymore? I'm not calling for any sort of great action. I'm not calling for any sort of profound movement. I'm saying one of the best things you can do to these people, and I'm not saying to tune everything out entirely, is to say, we know this game, we've been fed this line of bull before, and we're simply not going along with it. We'll continue. We won't break any laws. We'll continue to live normal, civilized lives, but we're not going to give anything more than is required of us. And that's the trap that people fall into every time. And that's one of the main things I brought up with Trump time and time again, where Trump does something that approximates something our interest, and you're expected to swear undying loyalty to the man, where the relationship is exactly the inverse. It is his duty as the head of state of the United States to serve the interest of his people, and that being the people, the American people, if you wanted to find that, I guess you could broadly say, of a predominantly European stock, just for the sake of argument. With a few other things grafted on, but I think everyone gets my point here. It is the bare minimum expectation that he acts in the interest and defense of those people first and foremost before anything else. And that him doing something approximating or him doing some sort of theatrics that makes you think he's doing that does not warrant your undying loyalty. Does not warrant a complete lack of criticism of him for anything else. It's the fact that no, that's his damn job, and that is what should be done. And if anything, you should be demanding more of him, and he should not be demanding more of you. And that's not only for Trump. That is look. If we've been sold this fantasy of liberal democracy, that's the arrangement that's supposed to exist. Hold these people to their own standards. If men have rights, not duties anymore, then give us our damn rights. It is just that simple.
Yes.
We're not playing this game. You have no duty beyond being a law-abiding citizen. It's just that simple. You do not owe these people anything extra.
Yeah. I can't. I can't add any.
But speaking of owing these things extra, you want to talk about a war in the Middle East?
Yeah. let's do that. What a great idea.
Yeah. BB, I think, is at his 6th visit since Trump reassumed office in 2025. Up there begging and pleading for war in Iran, which shows, although Trump is beholden to them, he was an absolute scraping a bottom of the barrel choice. He is proof that Romney did choke, the fact that they had to resort to him, because he is so difficult and so pedantic and so immovable on some issues that I don't know whether it's for political narrative reasons or whether he genuinely believes it, but ever since the Fordo strikes, he's insisted that we've done all we need to against Iran and that they'll never have a nuclear weapon, etc., 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 and that he's rested on his laurels. And you know what? As far as I'm concerned, let him have it. Let him think that he eviscerated the Iranian nuclear program. If it keeps us out of this nonsense, I'm all for it. I will let him peddle whatever narrative he wants in that regard. But BB is not happy with that. And we have this
Another visit.
Yeah, we have this back and forth where Kushner and Witkoff and the usual suspects are all plotting their next meeting with the Iranians in Geneva coming up this week, while we move 3 carrier strike groups to the region, or move strike groups to total 3 in the region, which is a massive amount of firepower. Now, the Iranians, looking at their military capabilities, if we're to believe some of the more robust claims about their missile program, could deal a great deal of damage to American carrier groups, which I'm inclined to believe that to a degree. I mean, if we go back to the Millennium Challenge 2002, that painted a pretty bleak picture. Now, I know war games can't always be relied on as a 100% accurate simulation of the way things would play out. But point being is, getting into a direct confrontation with Iran would probably result in more of a struggle than I think both the American populace and the American state apparatus are really willing to put up with. So they string them along with negotiations while backing these protests and funding the NGOs and smuggling in the Starlink terminals in order to create internal instability, etc., etc. And we play this song and dance, all while BB stomps his feet because it's not happening fast enough.
Yeah. I mean, this thing is so multifaceted. Some people are hypothesizing that the second carrier that the U.S. is moving toward the Persian Gulf is a ruse, that the attack will come before that. You are seeing reports of both the Chinese and the Americans, the Chinese and the Russians sending more supplies, military supplies, and other supplies. In fact, I think the Russians have like 5,000 men stationed there. So this is a bigger effort than what we saw last year during the so-called 12-day war. Electronic warfare systems are something that the Iranians have never used, that the Russians are supplying them. The Russians have also supplied them with more jets and helicopters. As well as the Chinese. I'm less sure what the Chinese are giving them, but the Chinese are thinking of selling them various jets, stealth jets that they've created that fared well during that short spat between India and Pakistan. Is it enough? Is this enough? Obviously, America is not going to invade Iran. Okay. And tomorrow, this is Friday the 13th, tomorrow's the 14th, Saturday. Tomorrow, Iran is supposed to witness another group of protests, and it will be led by the Bazaris, the merchant owners. These, no, I know, like
They're
some
halal
of our
merchants,
audience,
don't worry.
they're not Jewish. But Iran has a very old tradition. Of course, it's a very old civilization. It's been around a long time. So these groups have, they're an institution. They're the backers of the Islamic Revolution back in '79. But so if they're unhappy, and that's why I say it's multifaceted. Because in some ways, everybody who's talking about Iran, whatever side they fall on, does have some kind of valid point. There are exaggerations, but generally the Bazaris are unhappy. That's not good for the Iranian government. But they've also had a 23 million man march through various Iranian cities. Um, So, how big are these protests going to be? And of course, the other thing is the Iranians, and maybe the Russians already have been helping them vis-a-vis Starlink. The Iranians were able to track Starlink satellites, and the Americans have admitted that they sent thousands of them over to foment like a color revolution in Iran. Of course, these people have been rounded up. They're finished. The Starlink portals are gone. Now, I should say, just to shortly go back to Ukraine, it does tie in. Musk did turn off the Starlink satellite or whatever, which the Russians were using. Apparently, there's ways to piggyback this system, even if you're not Ukrainian or not on the American side of the ledger. But um, the Russians did manage to knock down a Mi-28 helicopter with like several important officers and crew on board without the Starlink. On the other hand, you could also make the argument that the Ukrainians that made those several incursions in Zaporozhye did so during the time that Starlink was down. Again, I don't know. You know, you don't always know when an army is going on rotation. There's other factors, but I would say that Starlink is not what I think people thought it was 3-4 years ago. So does that mean Iran is more prepared? I think yes, but I don't think Iran wants this. America certainly wants this, but America certainly doesn't want to fail doing this. Like they don't want the outcome that they had 6-7 months ago. They don't want another Greenland where essentially nothing happens. And that's why Benjamin Netanyahu is visiting the White House, what, for the fifth time in
Sixth
12
time.
months? Sixth time. Wow. He's there like literally every 2 months.
Donald, hurry up. We must build the third temple before the curse of the eighth decade takes hold.
I know, literally.
I imagine that's probably been every meeting they've had since 2025. And I do have to say, if the Israeli elite really are bought into this whole third temple messianic ideology, then I would imagine they probably have to be pretty afraid of the curse of the eighth decade sneaking up on them in the next couple of years. Which I'm not saying for certain it will, but I am saying, playing into their own logic, yeah, I would be concerned too if I were some sort of bizarre cultist who believes such things.
Mm. I mean, I think I would say that they are, that the Israelis are afraid of this.
Yeah, I mean, one can rightfully talk about the amount of destruction that has been waged in Gaza, and you can show all the pictures you want of just the complete evisceration of everything and anything there. But no matter how many hundreds of thousands of pounds of ordnance they've dropped in this place, no matter how many missiles they've fired into apartment buildings, no matter how many uh, civilians and soldiers alike they've wiped out, truth still stands is that they're not closer to any of their strategic goals, and in fact have been set back from them. What we've seen is, from the 12-day war in particular, is that the Iranians have the capability to penetrate their missile defenses. Their primary sponsor, the Americans, do not have, at this current time, the manufacturing capability to keep their skies defended, especially while their attention is divided between Europe and East Asia as well. And
Mm-hmm.
their arguably only victory in Syria has completely soured their relationship with Turkey, which was once a country they were on somewhat friendly terms with, which is another power player in the region that has the ability, if they want to project force against the Israelis. And it all comes together in what is really a perfect storm against them. The only country that seemed to have honored the Abraham Accords of any significance, because there are smaller countries like, I mean, who cares about Morocco, with all due respect to Morocco? They're not exactly a mover and shaker in the region, are they? But the only country of note that has managed to stick to the so-called Abraham Accords is the UAE, which is seeing a coalition built against it by the Turks, the Saudis, and the Iranians as we speak. Now, I know the Turks are infamously untrustworthy. I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them. But point being is, the region is now coalescing against them. Qatar has been shown to be at the mercy of Israel because it hosts an American base, even despite the positive relationship with the Iranians, and that. I mean, let's just look at some of the recent events out of the Middle East where, in the lead up to the upcoming negotiations and in the previous rounds of negotiations, the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, he held a phone conference with the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, all power players in the region, and Fidan, however you pronounce his name, Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister of Turkey, gave an interesting interview to their local affiliate of CNN, saying a couple interesting things, and this one's in regard to the 12-day war, saying a call he got from Rubio: tell the Iranians that anything could happen in the next few hours. So he did. So they're the intermediary. He posits that simply having U.S. airstrikes would not be enough to collapse the Iranian regime. Goes as far as to say that no comment on the question of whether Turkey should obtain its own nuclear weapons. He's pretty confident, judging by his sources, that there's not an imminent threat of war between the United States and Iran. And like I said, take his word for what you will. I'm not saying we have to take this guy at face value. But those are just some of the statements he's made in light of recent news. And I mean, while, like I said, I don't trust the Turks as far as I could throw them, and that in the event Iran were to fall under American attack, that the Turks wouldn't hesitate to be one of the vultures to scoop it up for its own interests, especially when it comes to its relation to the wider Turkic world. As it stands now, a coalition, not even a coalition, but a phone conference between the four countries I just listed would have been a bizarre occurrence up until, I would say, about 3 or 4 years ago. Up until, I mean, even in like 2018, 2019, Iran and Saudi Arabia were at each other's throats. It was a Chinese brokered agreement in 2021, 2022 that really changed the dynamics in the region. And the fact that you have, like I said, the four big players in the region, and there's others, but the four that certainly have the ability to project power outside their borders, even if it's just the neighboring countries. The fact that you can have them all on a phone call, mostly on the same page, I'd be sweating too if I were the Israelis, especially if most of these countries, all of them but Iran, are ostensible U.S. allies. And that we've seen just in recent years, especially since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, the ability of America to yank the leash of its allies anywhere outside of Europe is greatly diminished. Yeah, I can see why Netanyahu and why all of his people are starting to sweat. Despite the formidable military presence that the Israelis can put up, despite the ability to project power outside their own borders, despite their ability to play a key role in toppling the Syrian government, we're seeing a coalition form against Israel that we arguably haven't seen since 1948, if you want to go that far.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this has to work. This is it. It has to work. I think they feel they're at a point where they can no longer kick the can about Iran. And it has to work. And both sides, of course, the Israelis want the destruction or the subjugation of Iran. Like, what is his name? The stupid prince.
They want Reza Pahlavi, whose
Pahlavi,
wife is, I think, having an affair. I think that was exposed, or maybe that was
and his daughter married a Jewish guy.
That doesn't narrow it down.
They need this to work, and of course, it won't be a united Iran. They want this country fractured, right? It would be a way to isolate Russia. Americans, the Anglo world wants this. The Jewish world wants this.
Various financial interests
and it has to, for them. It just has to work. It just has to happen.
Yeah, their perception is that this is the last stop before America is unable to do something like this in the future.
Yes,
and I'd say I think their assessment is correct. I think their assessment that the America of 2030 is not going to be able to execute the kind of regime change they want, and even arguably the America of 2026 is not capable of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And with all of that said, I think we are running up into very dangerous territory, because I'm not saying that you're going to be able to secure the cooperation of these four nations, considering the fact that particularly the Turks, and this might just be my personal bias speaking, are going to be willing to drive the dagger into the back of whatever one's most convenient at the time. But even assuming you're able to get some sort of coherence, I'm not even talking a military alliance, but some sort of agreement on the Israel question from these nations. Israel still has 80 nuclear warheads. They can, in a moment of desperation, send not only anywhere in the region, but anywhere in the world. And that if they think their existence is threatened, there's a real possibility that they will make millions of people, if not tens or hundreds of millions of people, suffer if they have to suffer. It really could come down to that, which I think that's my big fear, because I think we're running up to a point where conventionally the Israelis are not able to secure victory. Even with the backing of the United States, a conventional victory looks further and further from the realm of possibility, which leads to more extreme options being explored. In which case, I would say nuclear weapons are the most extreme of options, and that if the situation were with Iran...
Yeah, I don't rule that out.
I mean, imagine a scenario in which America didn't bomb Iran in the 12-Day War. And this isn't an endorsement of Trump's military action against Iran last year.
Yeah.
But imagine a scenario where the escalation between Israel and Iran reaches the point where Israel considers using a nuclear weapon. And that is the final piece of blackmail. Even if the Epstein network fails, even if all the other clientele and patronage networks that they've spent decades meticulously set up, if all of those fail, they have the big red button that they can threaten the world with.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I mean, what do you think of the whole Epstein thing? If Trump doesn't do this then there's going to be more Epstein files released that will implicate Trump as a bargaining tactic. Because you could argue, in terms. Let's backpedal a little bit about bargaining, right, and about leverage. Obviously, like Iran now, countries like Russia and China are going to have more leverage over Iran in the future. But just like during Vietnam, it's going to give them more leverage over the U.S., right? In a way, less autonomy for Iran uh, might actually preserve Iran, paradoxically speaking. I know that sounds insane,
Well,
right?
I think up
But we
until
have Vietnam as an example. Vietnam is here. It survived that war, et cetera, et cetera. Russia and China don't, you know, tell Vietnam everything it has to do. So it's quite possible, right? Like, I
yes,
hope people understand that.
and I think even a more recent example is before Assad fell. One of the main stopgaps for conflict in Syria is the fact that the Israelis felt they could negotiate with Syria through the Russians, and that they could trust the Russians, or at least thought they could trust the Russians to put limits on what Assad
Yeah.
does. And I think we saw the ultimate outcome of that. But I do think, yeah, Vietnam is a much more long-lasting example of that, where their, I don't want to say subjugation, but their vassalization, in a sense, to
Yeah.
that power block did secure their existence in the long term. And that
Yes.
I mean, they're a small, mid-sized nation, but they have a bit of economic weight to throw around. They are a go-between
Hmm.
nation for the U.S. and China, and despite the troubled history between Vietnam and China, they still do maintain a very robust relationship.
Yeah.
And that many in Vietnam do see China as a preferable partner to the United States. I'm not saying a majority, but it's a significant amount of both the population and the elite that do have those leanings, especially now as the so-called BRICS is becoming more of a force in the world, at least in the economic sense. And you could, yeah, see a similar situation with the Iranians, where them accepting, let's say, more diktats from the Russians and or the Chinese could be the key there. And I do think that is the key there, because that's just the history of great power
Hmm.
politics, and that's what we're
Hmm.
returning to.
Hmm.
But a lot of that hinges on the fact that the United States is going to competently play the game of great power politics and not act as if it's the unipolar moment 30 years ago and try to issue ultimatums to the countries of the world that it maybe could have enforced back then, but certainly cannot enforce now.
Hmm.
Which is where you also run the risk of more extreme options being used. And while I think the Israelis are more likely to use a nuclear weapon against the Iranians, I've said for years, going all the way back to 2018 when we first talked about possibility of conflict with Iran, I believe the United States is more likely to use nuclear weapons than they ever are to try to implement another draft.
Yeah. Yeah. So who knows? Who knows what we're going to see? Does America have more than 2 weeks worth of intense strikes? I know Israel would prefer not to attack because it would prefer to blame America for this, right? Um, Now the vector is such that America would it would be easier for America to attack from the coming in from the west, but from the northwest. But as who was in Azerbaijan recently? The Americans were there. But Azerbaijan has said that they're not going to allow the Americans. In fact, several countries, including Saudi Arabia, have said that they can't use their airspace.
I wonder what is it? You know, that last year they were okay with it, but not this year. What is the red line? People have said that, well, you know, it's because of Gaza. I don't know how it could be because of Gaza.
No, no.
I mean, it plays a role, but why didn't Gaza play a bigger role when the bombing and the extermination, the genocide of Palestinians last year was worse than this year? That's the part I don't get.
Yeah, I would agree that Gaza does have some weight to it, but if I had to say the difference between 2025 and 2026 is the fear that this could escalate into something far bloodier
Yes.
than it did in 2025. I think everyone understood, the Iranians included, that Trump was going to crater a few empty research facilities and tout
Yes.
that as a
Yes.
victory until the day he dies. And that may optimally be what is the status quo. That's what I would like to see. Trump can rest on his laurels of this victory for the rest of his life, as far as I'm concerned. But I think there is a real fear now from the countries in the region that would have to bear the brunt of this conflict igniting, that are not willing to partake in it because of that reason, because they're going to be the ones who have to bear the direct consequences of it.
Plus, I mean, that's an excellent point. I think that explains everything. Plus, I suppose it's also cumulative, right? Like, can the you know can the Arab street take one more humiliating defeat, political defeat? Because that's kind of what this is, right? Their country isn't being bombed, but politically it's being subjugated. Can they handle one more? You know, I think there's the effect of accumulation of how much longer can this go on. I mean, there is supposed to be some kind of a peace agreement. This sounds like they're backtracking. So yes, but it remains to be seen whether the Americans will ignore it, or there'll be a last minute decision, or some other route is found. We should remember that the Shia forces in Iraq are, are have received air defense systems, which I don't think they had before. Area 54, which was that area wedged between Iraq and Syria, the Americans have left because, of course, they got their former ISIS Al Qaeda buddy to run Syria,
Yeah, the Kurds have
to make the
served
Israelis happy.
the Kurds have served their purpose. They can be liquidated.
Yes, I noticed that calmed down a bit, but I saw more videos today of three Kurd civilians that were killed. And in fact, Jelani has said that we still have a right to revenge. Still haven't settled the score. Imagine that. Like, well, you didn't want to be united under Assad. Now you've got this.
I think Trump is wrong. Jelani should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. He united Syria for the first time in 14 years, 15 years.
He brought he brought peace to Syria. The way Netanyahu brought peace to the Gaza Strip. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think the fact that Machado got it and then handed over to Trump next time he meets Jelani, on top of a nice little bottle
I've
of
never
perfume,
seen anything so lame in my life. It's just
on top
pathetic.
of a nice little bottle of perfume, he needs to pass on the Nobel Peace Prize to its real winner, Jelani.
I'm sorry, Trump is gay. Trump is gay.
He's a gay sultan. We cracked the code
Yes.
about a month ago at this point. It's been like a month since that episode. But that's most of what I had for the Middle East. I have a few. I know we're running a little long, so I'll keep it quick. But I have a few news items on East Asia, and that is Xi Jinping has purged the Chinese military,
Yes.
as if the implication that a head of state should be like commander in chief of the armed forces is an idea. It's unique to the Chinese communist system. Nobody else has ever thought of this.
Oh yeah.
This is unprecedented in all of the history of civilization. Okay.
Shouldn't corporations, predominantly Jewish, be running your country?
Okay. The head of state, as commander in chief of the armed forces, never had the authority to dismiss officers before. This is a completely novel thing that Xi Jinping has come up with.
Yeah. The thing is, they've had purges in the 90s.
Yeah.
They had them in the 80s. They had them over, what was it? In the 90s, they kind of privatized them. They the army, the military facilities could be used for civilian purposes, and the army made money from that. And then there was like some kind of reversal that took place in the late 90s, early 2000s. So it's not like, they're trying. I mean, obviously, there's reasons why they're trying to inflate this being bigger than it is.
Yeah,
and make it appear that it's without precedent.
And it is, of course, always multi-pronged. And I'll get into some stuff about Japan later, my concerns there. But with all that being said, the speculation is that he's building his war cabinet. He's building his his stack of generals so he can finally seize Taiwan, and because it's going to happen any day now. But I will say, in all seriousness, in a more level-headed analysis of this, me taking the situation actually seriously, I do think that on top of a regular purge of officers, this happens in every country, and it's not like these people have been arrested or executed; they've just been simply dismissed from their position. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. Like, there's been no criminal trial proceedings over this. It's just that he fired some guys. It's just that's what it comes down to. Moving,
people get fired. Look at the Trump administration. Look at the Putin administration. That's pretty normal.
People get fired. People get shuffled around. I mean, Shoigu, who used to be Minister of Defense, is now as part of the Security Council, was actually in China. I do have to say, on a serious note, I could see a scenario in which case they are reorienting the top brass of the Chinese military in anticipation of conflict, not because they're finally going to seize Taiwan, but because global tensions are rising to such a point, they're expecting a conflict to break out. Let's just say, rough timeline, next 5 to 10 years that they'll have to respond to. Maybe they won't be directly involved in it. Maybe they're appointing guys who will be able to give a more coherent response to, say, an American intervention in Iran, and how to indirectly support the Iranians or support the Iranians through back channels, etc., etc. There are a number of different things this could be. Or it could just be a routine cabinet shuffle. I know it's the military, but a routine shuffle of personnel, as happens all the time in every nation for a number of reasons. But moving into my point about Japan, Japan recently had an election, and of course, the party that's been in power since the end of World War II, more or less. There's a few times, a few examples of times they did seize power. And I'm not going to pretend to be a luminary in Japanese politics the way I pretend to be a luminary in European politics or Russian politics. I'm sorry to disappoint anyone. But as it stands, the status quo more or less won. There's a lot of hyping of this woman they put in power. Now, it reminds me a lot of the narrative that they spin around Maloney, where it's like, oh, look, this based right-wing nationalist who's going to curtail the migrant problem, which, yes, to my understanding, does exist in Japan, not nearly as severe as it is in other parts of the world, and understandable frustrations coming from those. And like I said, I have no problem with any of that. But when this woman first came to power through the regular parliamentary politics, where she was appointed party leader before calling these elections, one of her things was fetching about Taiwan, about whatever. And the real tell she wasn't a Japanese nationalist, I said this before, I'll say it again, is the fact that she called it Taiwan, not Formosa. I don't know much about the Japanese, but I do know any self-respecting Japanese nationalists called Taiwan Formosa. But that's aside the point. But I do fear, and I'm not saying this is a certainty, I'm not even saying it's a likelihood, that the way, at least this is being portrayed in the Western media, because I don't speak Japanese, and once again, If it's not an Indo-European language and I'm not learning it, I went on this rant at the beginning of the episode. I'm not going to go on it again. With all due respect to the Japanese and all other non-Indo-European speaking peoples, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to learn your language. Not even the Hungarians. I'm not even going to try to broach that one. But with all that being said, I do fear we run into a similar narrative with Ukraine, where they are priming the pump. They are tapping into latent nationalism, which they will always allow to exist, even if they do kvetch about it, to drum up historical grievances between the Chinese and the Japanese, because they are anticipating a wider conflict in East Asia, and they want to lay the groundwork for that. I do think that's certainly a possibility, but once again, I don't think the logistics really exist in the same way in Ukraine. Ukraine was very easy to supply with the American military networks in Europe and with the population base it had. Even though it didn't have much of a young population, it still had a great deal of fighting age men. Even though a lot of the men on the front
far
lines,
more than most European countries.
yeah, absolutely. Even though a lot of the men on the front lines in Ukraine are a bit past their prime, some may say, they were still able to feel that force. Now, it's been demographically apocalyptic for them, to say the least. But the Japanese, I don't see, and they are a larger nation than Ukraine, but I don't see with the geography and the population the same dynamics playing out. Are you going to get the Chinese trying to make some sort of landfall into Japan? They're not going to do that. Are you going to get the Japanese trying to make some sort of landfall into China? I doubt that. Maybe a conflict on the Korean Peninsula with the Chinese and Japanese on each respective side. That could be something. That could be how this plays out. Maybe a pitched naval battle over Taiwan. I'm not saying that I'm even anticipating that. That could be something. But even in terms of naval power, it's still the Americans who are
How serious is Japan about defending Taiwan?
They're not.
Did she not make claims that she would?
I mean, I personally, even I can't recall her exact words, but I personally cannot see the Japanese population mobilized in defense of Taiwan, even if you drudge up all of the heated history between the Chinese and the Japanese, even going beyond World War II. I simply do not see that as the case, that the Japanese are not going to get themselves killed for the Taiwanese, who are ethnically Chinese themselves.
Yeah. I mean, this is also we're in a very different world than, 1938 or 37.
And if anything, what we see right now, some news I saw that kind of surprised me, is that the Japanese right now are actually opening more offices in Russia for Russians to apply for visas to Japan. And I imagine most of that's probably just like temporary for tourism and business, just like the usual stuff. I don't think they're trying to, court like some massive like Russian emigration. I don't think that's happening. But you have that. You have the Sakhalin pipeline still online. Sakhalin 1 and 2 still online, where a significant amount of Japan's energy sector that still fuels its functioning industrial economy, unlike Germany, that comes from Russia. This woman, Takaichi, I believe is how you pronounce her name, forgive me if that's incorrect, is also, every once in a while, brings up the idea of signing a formalized peace treaty with the Russians vis-a-vis the Kuril Islands, because that was never resolved at the end of World War II. And there's multiple ways you can slice that. But point being is, the rhetoric of the people who are either A, Japanese nationalists themselves, or B, view them as, once again, one of these sort of spearheads, these gladio nationalists, as you were, does not match the actions the Japanese state itself takes. I mean, even going back to the days of the late Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated in 2022, one thing I do know about the region is that under him, during Trump's first term, trade volume between China and Japan actually increased. And that, I'm not saying this is certain. I'm not saying this is even likely, once again. But the Japanese are also in an interesting position where they could feasibly act like Turkey and be a go-between between the U.S. and China, where if they have, and I don't think the current crop of leadership is either capable or willing to do this, but they are positioned in a way, if the right person or the right regime were to come along, where they could walk that tightrope in the Asia Pacific, similar to how Turkey walks that in Europe and the Middle East.
Well, there was a Western company, I believe a French company, if I'm not mistaken, that donated 500 million rubles to the SMO. They're still in Russia. I just read that today. So I don't know.
Yeah, the things become much more complicated, I will say, when you actually look at the economic relations and you look at those sort of dealings that do happen between these countries. And while I'm not saying that makes conflict impossible, I do say it muddies the waters. And I'll be the first to say, well, I think there are some people in the event of any sort of escalation with China that would like Japan to emulate Ukraine. It the conditions aren't there. I At least I don't see it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. This is kind of like getting Poland to attack Russia in case Estonia is threatened. I don't know. I mean, it's even that's not a proper comparison
No, because
because
I could see the Poles throwing themselves into the fire for the Balts for some reason.
well, I mean, they're also close by,
Yeah, and
et cetera, et cetera.
there's a land connection, but one of the big complicating factors for both Japan and Taiwan is that they are islands, and like I said, with Ukraine, you have that pre-existing American military structure and that pre-existing NATO military structure that can funnel aid into Ukraine via multiple land borders.
Yeah. I mean,
That's
this would be disastrous because Japan's economy is also not doing well.
No, it's not. And uh, while it has been certainly a large economy, the idea of Japan as a really an economic powerhouse has not been reality in since at least the 1980s, as far as I'm aware of the history.
Yeah,
Where
all the quantitative easing that was first developed there in Japan before the Americans started doing it in the late 90s and the 2000s. Um, uh, Japan has the largest sovereign debt to GDP of any country.
yeah, it's
It's not
bizarre.
the largest debt, right? America's debt is larger, but I mean, relative to the GDP, it's the largest one. So I don't know how are they going to manage this.
And
Besides, I mean, we're really projecting here because there's no indication China is going to invade Taiwan while Iran is threatened.
yeah, that's really what it comes down to. And I will say something interesting about the Japanese debt that I did hear is that a lot of it is beholden to domestic interests, which I'm not saying makes a huge difference, but does make a difference. A lot of it is to their central bank as well as other private
Yes.
investors in the country. And while a lot of American debt is internally held, I have to say it looks a bit like a brothel when you look at who holds American debt or who America's in debt to. It compared to the Japanese at least. But no, these are not the conditions for conflict. And I think that modern Ukraine is probably the benchmark for a conventional conflict. And we overlooked a lot of the sites. And in our defense, they'd hyped this up for years since 2014. Russia is going to invade Ukraine any day now, et cetera, et cetera. But you look at the lead up in late 2020, late 2021, early 2022 in Ukraine. It's pretty clear in retrospect those were the makings of conflict. I do not see anything approximating that situation anywhere in the Asia Pacific right now.
Right. And the Russians tried for months to negotiate a new security agreement in Europe.
Yes, and we're rebuffed at literally every turn. And with all that said, like I said, there is no equivalent situation anywhere in the Asia Pacific right now, whether that's East Asia, whether that's the Korean Peninsula, whether that is Southeast Asia, whether that's the Philippines, Indonesia, whatever it might be. The the makings of at least a conventional conflict are simply not there, and I maintain if it's going to flare up anywhere, it's going to be on the Korean Peninsula. And I'm not even saying that's
Yeah,
likely, but it is the
highly
most likely.
unlikely. Yeah, yeah. There's no triggering event. China's not going to take the bait. Uh, China has to act eventually, but I think they're waiting for a historical moment where America won't be able to do anything.
Yeah,
And when that moment comes, Japan will not want to intervene.
and then there's the other possibility that everyone tends to overlook, is that Taiwanese politics is still very internally divided. There aren't many sympathizers to, say, the Communist Party of China in Taiwan, but there still are plenty of people who view Taiwan as a part of China. The KMT still does exist, and they trade power back and forth with the other factions there, and they do envision unification with China on much different terms than, say, mainland China does. But point being is the sentiment is there. They still view themselves as Han Chinese. They still view themselves as part of the same broader nation that would be unified in an ideal scenario. And as time goes on, reunification with mainland China, even under a Communist Party government, might start to look more appealing. Or you might get internal reforms in China that would give way to a quote unquote multi party system or some sort of political reform in China that would be palatable to the KMT. These are all things that could very well play out over the course of the next several decades.
Oh my god!
Oh no!
This can't even be real.
Do we have a show finisher? Is that what you're trying to tell me? Do we have something that's going
No,
to?
I just because this was in the news, and it is hilarious.
Dear Lord, what's
You're not
gonna
gonna
be?
you're not gonna prepare yourself. This is hilarious.
Oi, 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 vey. Yeah, I forgot about this. Yeah, this was interesting. So, for context, the Iranians were having a rally where they burned an effigy of the demon Baal.
Baphomet.
Oh,
Ball. Yeah,
yeah.
but yes, more or less same difference.
Yeah, a matter of linguistics. And the implication is that it's supposed to represent America, the West, etc. And here's a little exchange that we have right here. So you have an Iranian putting this out there, and then a man by the name, or at least by the username of Alex Rosenberg, accompanied with an Israeli and American flag. He's certified. He paid the money. He paid Elon the toll. It seems this is by far the most anti-Semitic thing the Iranian regime has done.
And then dual citizen of the United States and Israel, co-author of New York Times bestseller The White Problem.
Oh no!
And rabbi.
They just
Israel Chai, whatever the hell that means.
It's some Yiddish phrase. Or is it Hebrew? Let's be honest. Contemporary Hebrew is not a real language. But yeah, here's the image you're referring to. Do not harass this person. All the regular disclaimers, etc., etc. This is just for the public interest of a public profile commenting on another public post, and that is what you need to know. But yeah, to end the show, I'll do another linguistic rant. Modern Hebrew is not a real language. It is a hacksawed reconstruction of elements from ancient Hebrew that you get from the Jewish religious text, Aramaic, which you get from the same Jewish religious text, and other Semitic languages, funny enough, largely from Arabic, constituting a large amount of the reconstruction. In fact, when the Israeli state was being established, many of the more religious Jews insisted Yiddish be the official language because they thought Hebrew should only be used in a religious context. But the constructionists, the reconstructionists, as it were, won out with that, and that a lot of those Hasidics, the ones you usually see protesting against conscription, are the Yiddish-speaking population of Israel.
I didn't know that.
And I can't believe I'm going to say this. Yiddish is an Indo-European language. It is a pigeon of sorts of High German, with some Semitic elements. So but it is broadly an Indo-European language. So I can't believe I'm saying this. I have to come down on the side of the Yiddish speakers. There also is a language called I believe it's spelled Ladino, like Latino, but with a D. That is a combination of Semitic elements with Spanish language that was spoken primarily by Sephardic Jews. However, you don't get any real equivalent with the Mizrahi Jews because they tend to speak either Arabic or Persian or wherever they might have ended up, which I think that's interesting. If you want to keep rambling on about linguistics, I could do this all day. But as for Mr. Rosenberg and his little Am Israel Chai, I believe that is a phrase from the Hacksaw Reconstruction language that is known as Modern Hebrew. And there's your, I'm by no means professional, but there is your linguistics lesson for the day. And that is what I'm going to close the show out on after, I don't know, probably 20 minutes, half an hour of rambling about East Asian politics. But I don't know. What other geopolitical reporting show are you going to get this from? Okay, where else are you going to get the tangents about the Uralic language, about the Indo-European languages? Funny enough, this comes up every once in a while. This is a shared fixation of ours, and it should not be a surprise that we have many of those, considering the fact we do the show and it goes the direction that it does. But unprompted, well, we've both talked to each other about this topic before. But it's... I don't know. It's interesting. But like I said, with all due respect to any audience members who may live in a country that does not speak an Indo-European language, or does not, I imagine if you're listening to the show, you probably speak English, at least some English, or does not speak in Indo-European language as your first language. I appreciate you bearing with us. Now I tend to exclude a lot of the Indo from that. I mean, I'll include the Farsi. I'll give the devil his due there. But I have to say, it is to my refusal, even to my dearest Hungarians, who I love. I'm not learning a non-Indo-European language, and that's that. And that's my final word for this show. Coming full circle. If you had any final comments you want to add either about that or anything else we discussed, or something completely new.
I do. It is tangential. There was an attack on a Russian refinery all the way in the Komi region. Now, as far as I know, the Komis are distant relatives to the original Hungarians who came from the southern part of the Urals and moved all the way into modern-day Hungary.
That is correct. In fact, the Komi language is the closest living relative to the Hungarian language.
Yeah, there we go.
So I'm glad that we managed to weave all this together. Don't worry, we had it completely planned out from the beginning.
It all ties together, folks.
But thank you, everyone, for tuning into another episode of The War Report. I imagine it's enlightening and as informative as ever. It's good to be back. I know we went a little longer than I anticipated, but there was a lot of ground to cover. And we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye, and take care.